There are a lot of obscure and lesser known things out there in the world of vanilla World of Warcraft. Things which separate it from other versions of the game, make it memorable, and above all, unique. Vanilla was full of these small RPG aspects which in some cases were planned for the game but never panned out, or just things that one developer one day thought, hey, this will be cool, I'm just gonna go put that in the game. And today I wanted to go over some of them, so hopefully you'll find something new, maybe it'll be a trip down memory lane. And if you want to see more of this type of content, definitely let me know, because vanilla is not short on secrets. With that said, let's make a start. At night, certain locations in the game have their NPCs change between different forms. The first one, which you'll have probably seen, especially if you were playing Season of Discovery during Phase 1, is in Pyrewood Village, a small Alliance-friendly town towards the south of Silverpine Forest, just near the Greymane Wall, aka the entrance to Gilneas. It's an elite zone and the Horde have a few quests to go and complete there, but when night hits, the townsfolk transform from humans into bloodthirsty Worgen, making them aggro onto both factions. This can be a bit of a shock when you zone out of SFK to go and vendor there, and the vendors are just straight up gone. But this makes a lot of sense for a whole village to turn at night, especially so close to where the Worgen were born. There is also another place this happens, and this one is kind of random to be honest, and that's the graveyard just next to the entrance for the dead mines. Okay, well it's not actually a functional graveyard, it sends you back to Sentinel Hill, but it sure looks like one. During the day there are vultures there, and at night, for some reason instead there are ghouls. I guess some Blizzard developer thought that this would be a cool change to have, and so they just made it happen. I believe these two places are the only areas where Blizzard use this mechanic of different mobs between day and night, but I think it's a fun idea and would have made sense in other places too. There is also one item in the game which is only available during certain seasons of the year in real world time, and that is, if you've enjoyed fishing you'll know, the winter squid. Available approximately from the 22nd of September to the 20th of March the following year, or about 180 days in real time, this fishing catch is used in an endgame food that boosts agility, and when the fishing season is off, people can really reap the rewards of making sure they've stocked up in the downtime before next season. It's a bit crazy, there's actually a usable endgame item that's only possible to get half of the year, but hey, that's vanilla World of Warcraft for you. And people always go out of their way to catch loads because it can be easy money in the long term. In future expansions, Blizzard would make certain content only available during certain types of weather. This is particularly true for battle pets, such as the Baby 8 from Jaguaro Isle just off the coast of Stranglethorn Vale, who only appears when it's raining, or the Silphid hatchling during sandstorms, or the Arctic Fox kit during snowstorms, and so on. This is a pretty interesting idea, and there is weather in vanilla World of Warcraft too. I wonder if someday this kind of mechanic could be incorporated into the game in some way. Next up, have you ever noticed how when you level up in Classic, you get +5 skill to your class's specialization? As in you're a mage, you'll get +5 skill to Frostfire and Arcane. Have you ever really wondered, why am I getting this? What's this all about? Well, it's a relic of the very old talent and leveling system from earlier versions of World of Warcraft that was scrapped pre-launch. It used to be the case that casting abilities and spell schools would give you skill points similar to how weapon skill works, which could then be used to upgrade certain abilities or stats which your character had. This was much more similar to older RPGs where you could start a character and then build them into pretty much anything that you had the vision for. But Blizzard was already taking a more class-based approach though, where each one of them would be innately different. So ultimately this was taken over by the talent system instead, and skill points were left in for things such as professions, weapon skills and so on, but they were just a metric to improve those stats by, not points you would actually spend. But they did leave your class skills improving in the game as a bit of flavor text to show that your character is growing and improving, and I used to think that this was all there was to say about this stat, but for one class and specialization, their class skill is actually relevant, and improving it does something, and that is of course for feral druids. So in Season of Discovery, Blizzard have put items in the game which increase the power of the feral combat class skill, which is equivalent to giving feral extra weapon skill, as can be seen here on some re-itemized Molten Core loot. I believe this is the first time ever a class skill has been able to be leveled beyond cap, and maybe there's more room for class improvement through this seemingly flavor only stat than we thought. Now, throughout vanilla World of Warcraft, if you're a hunter, there is absolutely no doubt you've heard of Broken Tooth. This was a highly valued pet, especially in PvP, and was reputed for his 1.0 attack speed. This was the fastest attack speed of any pet at the time, and will cause spell knockback to occur on every single attack. Equally, if you were Beast Mastery spec'd, it was very good for frenzy uptime, as your pet was attacking so often, it would be keeping those stacks rolling. However, there used to be a way more powerful pet in the game, and if you're Alliance, you've probably run past him several times in Duskwood, and he's called Lupos. Before 1.9, that'll be AQ, so quite late in vanilla, this pet used to do entirely shadow damage with their basic attack. Of course, shadow damage would ignore any armor, making this the highest DPS pet in the game by an absolute mile, and he would shred through armored targets in PvP and PvE like nothing. It was a very unique pet and the only one that worked this way, but probably too overpowered to be kept in this state, so Blizzard did end up nerfing him to do physical attacks instead of just shadow, and we never saw the shadow damage variation in Classic as we released on the final patch. Now, I have a few hidden locations in the game which you may or may not have come across. The first one is in the Hinterlands, and if you're on the Alliance side, you'll have ran past Shindigger's camp before if you've done the quest line. For Horde, this is a bit more out of the way, but if you're running up the hill on the way to the camp from the west to the east, if you make a left turn just before you actually get to the camp, you'll see a pass over the mountains into Western Plaguelands. If you start to run up here, it reveals the zone as Plague Mist Ravine, which also makes it pretty obvious on the map when you do so, and it will take you from this place in Hinterlands straight to the outside of Scholomance. This shortcut is not far off the beaten trail, but it's just so easy to miss that I bet a lot of people don't even know it's there. Saying that, I'm not really sure it is a shortcut to anything. It tends to be if you want to go to Scholomance, there's shorter ways to get there, and how many times do you really need to go from Western Plaguelands to the Hinterlands? Probably not that often, but hey, maybe this comes in somewhere for someone. There is another super obscure location in the game called Zalashi's Den. Again, you'll have run past this place so many times and you'll have no idea it's ever been there. It's a cave just hidden out of sight on the eastern coast of Tanaris, and it's home to a single Naga, named after the Den himself, Zalashi, who is just kind of there. What purpose is he for? Well, we never really found out. I guess somebody had intentions to use him for some content or a quest maybe, but nothing ever came to light on what his purpose was. I even found a thread from 2010 of people trying to figure out what his purpose was. Apparently they were being a bit led on by a GM as well, classic, but when the Cataclysm came around, he mysteriously disappeared. It's often the case in future expansions that Blizzard reused vanilla NPCs in one way or another, but Zalashi, who's never really served a purpose, disappeared one day and nothing has ever been heard from him since. Maybe we'll see him in a future expansion one day, but he's out there somewhere watching, waiting, and biding his time. Next is one which, if you've completed Naxxramas in vanilla and received the phylactery of Kel'Thuzad, you will have done, but I'm not sure if you'll have seen the quest all the way through. See, the start of the quest and the end of it are several expansions apart. So after you kill KT and you get the phylactery, it starts a quest which says, your better judgment dictates that you destroy the phylactery, preventing the Lich from ever reforming. Thankfully, you seldom listen to that internal voice of reason. Someone at Light's Hope will pay you hugely for this artifact. Who cares if Kel'Thuzad regenerates to full power? And so you hop along to Light's Hope Chapel to see if there's any takers for this undead soul of a powerful Lich, and unsurprisingly, there is, and it's none other than the guy that you trade for your priest tier 3, Father Inigo Montoy, who when you hand it over to him appears to be salivating and says you'll be greatly rewarded, give it here now. I mean, you do get a nice trinket to be fair, but our character isn't exactly the brightest here, and as we find out in Wrath of the Lich King, he returns it to Arthas, which enables Naxxramas to be reformed and Kel'Thuzad reborn once again, and as a reward for this, the Father is transformed into a powerful Lich himself. I mean, that's the lore reason Naxxramas was brought back. It totally wasn't Blizzard just bringing it back as a freebie because basically no one did it in vanilla. Anyways, we end up meeting Father Montoy in a quest once again in Dragonblight, where we see the Lichis become Thalzan the Duskbringer, and things are looking kind of shaky in our battle against him, but then along comes Tyrion Fordring to save the day. We beat him, and that is that. It's a bit of a long ending to a quest which starts in vanilla, but it is interesting. I guess even back then they knew they already wanted to bring back Kel'Thuzad in one way or another. Next up are some unused instance portals, which you've almost certainly seen around the world. Blizzard planned so many big things when they were first doing vanilla, and they just didn't have time to finish all of them all the way through. But just having those green swirly instance portals behind a set of bars really got the imagination going. And they also left something in the game which maybe Blizzard did get around to using eventually. There's of course the Storming portal, which was supposedly going to be used for player housing, a feature which was experimented with during the early versions of World of Warcraft, but ultimately never made it to live. In Dark Whisper Gorge, of course, there's the portal to Mount Hyjal, and a decent amount of work was also done on the mountain too in terms of zone building, environment, and so on. This was a big lore-driven place in the game, so whenever Blizzard ended up getting to use it, it had to kind of be a big deal, but again, it wasn't a zone we saw in vanilla, and the first look we'd have at Hyjal would be in a raid where we travel back in time during the Burning Crusade. And of course, the portal at the end of Strat Undead, the one near where all the undead skeletons run out when you're fighting your way to Baron Rivendell. This was going to be the portal to Naxxramas, but again didn't make it to live, and instead you had to pay your way to get teleported up into Nax. Oh, and a bonus thing here, when you zoned into Nax in vanilla, it was a one-way trip. There was no way to leave. There being an instance portal inside a dungeon very much followed how they did Molten Core and Blackwing Lair initially, where similarly those two have a raid portal inside of Blackrock Depths and Upper Blackrock Spire, but I guess by the time they got around to Naxxramas, they decided, well, we've done achievements anyway so people don't have to go running through a dungeon, let's just not bother this time. Speaking of dungeons though, despite it being super common for everyone to always take 5 players to a dungeon, the majority of the dungeon content in Classic can take more players than that if you really want to. In fact, as of patch 1.12, the final patch of vanilla, there are only 3 dungeons in the game where you can strictly not bring more than 5 players at one time. Those being Blackrock Depths, Strat Undead and Living, okay maybe those count as 2, and Scholomance. Every single other dungeon in the game could take 10 players. You could do a 10-player Gnomeregan, Deadmines, Zul'Farrak, pretty much anything you wanted, but people never bothered doing this, and to be honest it's not hard to see why. Being over 5 affects the experience you receive greatly, you have way more people to roll against for loot, and perhaps biggest of all the quests in dungeons are not possible to complete in a raid group, so really you could bring more than 5, but why ever would you? The exception to this is of course Upper Blackrock Spire, which is the only dungeon where bringing 10 players is seen as the norm, and there are several reasons why it works here. People tend to be close to our level cap, so XP isn't quite as highly valued, quests are tagged as raid wide so they can be completed, and well, it's just kind of difficult compared to a lot of other dungeon content. There's a bunch of dangerous mobs and large trash packs, and if you were going in there with 1 tank and 1 healer, it would be kind of challenging to be honest. And whilst you'd all get more loot as 5, people just started doing it as 10, and that's still the normal way to do it all these years later. And finally, despite the name World of Warcraft, PvP was pretty thin at launch to be honest, and initially at least it was very much up to players to make their own content within the game. And if you didn't play on launch, you may not remember just how little there really was. There was certainly no arenas, we didn't get those till TBC, there were no battlegrounds at launch, we'd get Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley sometime shortly after, and then Arathi Basin sometime after that. There was no honor and ranking system, there was no PvP gear, there wasn't even a way to queue for Battlegrounds cross-server until the final patch of vanilla. If you wanted to do a Battleground back in the day, you had to go over to your Battleground master, queue it up, and you'd have to hope there'd be enough people also queuing on your server for it to start. It definitely built up rivalries, and PvP was more active back then, especially in the Battleground scene I'd have to say. But the World of Warcraft, when it first released from a PvP standpoint, was I see a red bar on my screen, I'm gonna go get them. And hey, you know what they say all these years later? Red is dead. And sometimes those player player-driven rivalries and stories you can make by yourself are more than enough without all the extra content. But anyways, those are just a few obscure or strange bits of information about vanilla World of Warcraft. Despite the game at times showing its age, it certainly was unique in the way that it approached many different aspects of the MMO, and there's a reason we're all still coming back to it all these years later. The vanilla World of Warcraft has perhaps the most secrets and interesting facts out of any version of WoW we've ever got. During the development of the game, so many ideas were considered. Some of them ended up getting into the game fully, some were cast aside, and others ended up being relics which can be found within the game but never really went anywhere. After all, vanilla was just a bunch of guys putting stuff in the game which they thought sounded cool, and to that end, I think they did a pretty good job. It was a totally different approach to the game compared to nowadays, and it certainly shows. So today I'm going to be talking about some more random and potentially useless bits of vanilla information that you may or may not have known about. These facts will be from all corners of the game too, ranging from the alpha to things which did end up getting in the finished game. So with that said, let's make a start. We all know Classic for the length of the leveling journey, and a big part of that has always been working on your professions. But did you know at one point there were way more planned secondary professions that the player will be able to pick up as part of that journey? We had foraging, which sounds quite similar to what herbalism would have been. We had tracking, you have to imagine this would be hunting animals. We had brewing, you already know dwarves would have had some kind of racial bonus here. Imagine going back to the inn to check on the progress of your brew. Or maybe it was even linked to player housing, which was also tested during very early development. And there was also cartography, a profession to draw out your own map of the world. Imagine instead of discovering somewhere on your map and it just appears, you had to go back to an inn or take out some paper and write that down. You could also chart things such as caves, mines, hidden locations, and so much more. You might think this all sounds a lot more survival game-esque than it being perhaps an mmorpg, and it kind of does, to be honest, because there was also a skill which was literally called survival skills. This was designed to be complementary to existing skills such as cooking or fishing, and it allowed you to, for one, create fires. Here's a post from 2004 which says, "You may also want to train survival skills, which will allow your character to create campfires. Campfires are used to cook, and being able to create a campfire will allow you to almost always cook anywhere." Whereas in the game, of course, nowadays you can just buy materials from a vendor for fires instead of it being its whole own profession. You could also light torches to provide a minor spirit buff to party members, as well as a small light aura around you at night. I reckon during development, Blizzard thought there wasn't enough to some of these professions for them to really make the cut. I guess nobody told them about half the skills in RuneScape, so they were either added into the game in other ways, such as the campfires, or ultimately removed. A lot of cool ideas here though, especially the torches lighting up areas at night. The epic mounts that we have in vanilla since its re-release in 2019 were not the original epic mounts which existed in the game. From vanilla's release in November 2004 until about April 2005, epic mounts looked different. The reason was that Blizzard just hadn't finished the models of epic mounts yet, and so they didn't have armor. And in patch 1.4, the option was added to trade in your old no armor epic mount for one of the newer ones which were familiar with. A decision which meant in retrospect you traded in an extremely rare unobtainable mount for one that pretty much everyone would have in a few expansions time, but that's just hindsight. Getting to 60 back in the day and having enough gold for an epic mount within about 4.5 months though from launch was actually nuts. You had to have been a full-on no-lifer to have one of the no armor mounts. Blizzard were actually asked whether they would bring these unarmored epic mounts back for Classic too. I can't find the original blue post or interview, it might have been deleted, but in short they said no, they weren't going to add them back as they didn't want people to feel rushed to get to 60 and to earn loads of gold so that they could buy them before they were removed in accordance with the time period which they existed in the game originally. Season of Discovery put some unarmored mounts back in the game though, so there's that, but beyond Season of Discovery we've still never seen these elusive mounts return to Classic. During your Classic journey you may have noticed a troll towards the southeast entrance to Ungoro Crater named Morvek, who's part of the Ravasor trainers. In fact, this is its own complete reputation, but it serves no purpose in vanilla whatsoever. There's another member of the Ravasor trainers up north too, but she was also removed in TBC. Ravasor Skill trainers were designed to be the cord counterpart to the Alliance Winter Spring trainers. At least that's what I assume, it does appear that way. Winter Spring trainers is of course a long grind to eventually get yourself a unique mount, and it seems the intention for this troll and his faction was the same, but they just never got round to finishing it in vanilla. In Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard finally got around to updating this quest and allow players to do dailies, which in time would award the Venomhide Ravasor as a mount. It's perhaps a questline that Blizzard could pick back up in a vanilla setting one day. The next one I have for you has a bit of a Burning Crusade crossover, and it's regarding the Moonkin. So Moonkins, at least in vanilla, are known for going in no time and having generally terrible mana management, and for a long time they have needed some way to be better at restoring mana. But what if they were meant to be more of a melee caster hybrid than what we ended up getting? If you think about it, the vast majority of the Moonkin or Owl Beast that you encounter out in the world only use melee attacks. There are a few in Winterspring that use Moonfire, I believe. In TBC, however, Blizzard added this interesting bit of text to Moonkin form, saying attack power is increased by 150% of your level, as well as melee attacks in this form have a chance on hit to regenerate mana based on attack power. Now of course in TBC, Moonkins had other talents created to address their mana issues, but in World of Warcraft oftentimes old ideas are left in the game or not used for a while, so perhaps this was at one point intended to be a fix for balanced druids in vanilla, but it just wasn't implemented until TBC. Now maybe there is some secret melee weaving Boomkin genius out there that I'm not aware of, and the melee Boomkin was used in TBC, but from what I remember, this piece of extra text on Moonkin form never really did anything. But if we look at the Boomkin talents in vanilla, we have things such as natural weapons, which increase physical damage by 10%, or clear casting, which could only be procced by meleeing back then. Now to be honest, many vanilla talent trees did want you to get some points off a number of different trees, but it does support the melee Boomkin theory that I've got going here. Then again, druids already had bear and cat form. Do you really want to stand in melee range as a caster as well? Maybe not. Either way, I thought I'd throw the melee weaving Boomkin theory out there. What do you think? Does it make sense, or is it just a coincidence? The tier 2 armor that existed in the game used to look absolutely terrible. In patch 1.9, that's AQ40, Blizzard updated tier 2 armor from Blackwing Lair, Onyxia and Ragnaros, and this may just be one of the best armor updates I've ever seen, giving us iconic sets such as Bloodfang and Judgment. They even revamped tier 2 again as part of World of Warcraft's 20th anniversary. It's truly a tier set to remember. Also, did you know that Molten Core used to drop either tier 1 or tier 2 items? In patch 1.4, the majority of tier 2 items were removed from Molten Core and brought back in World of Warcraft's second major raid tier, Blackwing Lair. I guess they just kept the tier 2 legs and helm dropping from Rag and Onyxia as a bit of an extra reward for taking down a big named boss. You used to be able to stand way back from your raid group inside of an instance and not enter combat. Some people would be assigned just to resurrect others who fell during fights so they could get rebuffed and get back in the fight. Gives a new meaning to battle res, doesn't it? Next up is a hidden location called Newman's Landing. If you swim far around on the coast from Menethil Harbour, you'll eventually arrive here. And if you played a paladin during Season of Discovery and got the Sheath of Light rune, you're gonna remember this because you spent about 15 to 20 minutes to get here. It's speculated to be when new Alliance characters are briefly spawned in before being teleported over to their correct starting zone, hence the name Newman's Landing. Before Taurens had mounts, they had something called plains running. Now you've probably heard of plains running. Essentially, instead of a racial mount, Taurens would just gather speed as they moved, and it would take them 10 seconds to get up to their maximum speed. However, there were definitely some problems with plains running, and I can understand why it was eventually removed. First of all, the 10-second acceleration time compared to a 3-second cast time for a regular mount. Second was, if you got hit by anything, you would stop, which would make this an absolute nightmare to use in, well, the majority of the game, to be honest. And that's why eventually the Kodo mount was added for this race. Also, if you've seen the NPC Tauren walking up and down Stranglethorn Vale, Samantha Swifttooth, she used to be a trainer for plains running and they just left her in the game. So if you've ever wondered what the point of that NPC is, that's it. There are so many really overpowered items in vanilla which are still in the game, such as the Goblin Rocket Helm, Free Action Potion, Magic Dust and many more, but there was one that was so powerful and broken that it even had to be removed during vanilla World of Warcraft. This was the large rope net which dropped from Defias trappers over in Westfall. It was a farmable item which would root people for 10 seconds when used, and it was removed in patch 1.7 as it was just too good. It's kind of funny that Magic Dust, which is another very powerful consumable, also drops from a mob in Westfall. Whichever developer was working on that zone definitely had some fun with unique drops. Then again, magic dust is a lot harder to farm. So I'm sure you've all heard of the warrior trinket Diamond Flask. It's from the Sunken Temple Warrior class quest. There's a very well-known alternative use for it, where essentially warriors can pick up a bunch of healing gear, equip the Diamond Flask trinket, use it, it will snapshot all their healing gear, then change back to their regular gear apart from the Diamond Flask, and the trinket will continue its on-use healing effect as if you still had all that healing gear on. So it's legitimate for warriors to put together a Diamond Flask set so they can benefit from this. But it's not just that I want to tell you about, it's that, well, Diamond Flask shouldn't really work like this in vanilla. In fact, in patch 1.7 there's a little bit of text which says all item-based self-heals will no longer be affected by equipment that provides bonuses to healing. So why does Diamond Flask continue working despite this? Who knows, but I guess warriors keep on winning in vanilla. Alterac Valley used to be way different compared to the version that we got on patch 1.12 in Classic. There used to be mines throughout the entire battleground, way more powerful NPCs on both sides, and mini-bosses such as Korik the Blood Rager that would occupy the Field of Strife. He even had a unique drop table. This is why back in the day battles will last for sometimes days on end because pushing was extremely difficult, whereas today the two factions often pass each other like two ships in the night. The Wildhammer clan reputation exists in Classic in the Hinterland zone, and it's nearly useless. There are a few quests associated with it, but in terms of reputation rewards, there is nothing, apart from the fact that at Honored you'll get a discount on the flight path in Airy Peak, so that's better than nothing, just about. This next one may be the rarest item in vanilla, which is available to players. If you've ever seen this, you are incredibly lucky. I have never seen it ever playing World of Warcraft for as long as I have. It's a pair of legs which are dropped in Zul'Farrak by trolls called Spell Shock leggings. I've no idea why the drop rate is so stupidly low on these, but they are a very good pair of legs for the level that they're available at. Just know if you ever manage to get these somehow that you get a good amount of gold for them. Speaking of strange items, there's one epic item in vanilla which is perhaps worse than any other epic. It's called the Lion Horn of Stormwind, and you may just have never seen anyone using this. You've probably moused over it on the auction house and thought, wow, that sounds bad. It says when you're struck in combat you have a 1% chance of increasing all party members' armor by 250 for 30 seconds. What it should actually say on the text is just -1 trinket. It's not even that 250 armor isn't much, which to be honest it isn't, it's barely anything. It's more, when would your party ever need this? Are you all expecting to get hit by a physical attack? I guess it's an interesting flavor item, but it's never really found much of a use within the game. The entire world of vanilla is not short on secrets and just things which are really easy to miss unless you go looking for them, or in some cases you know where to look in the first place. So today I'm back uncovering some of the lesser known sides of vanilla World of Warcraft. As always, do let me know if you knew about any of these or whether you found anything new, and is there anything that you would have added to this list. Let's start off with one that you'll probably know about if you're on the Alliance side, but maybe not so much on the Horde. Around 7 AM server time, children gather together in the upstairs of a house next to Mirror Lake. These children are Dana, Aaron, Cameron, John, Jose, and Elisa. And the odd thing is here how they all move upstairs together and then form what a lot of players have speculated to be some kind of pentagram, and then in an almost demonic way stand in this ritual formation, strangely shuffling about and just being a bit unsettling. It doesn't help that some Blizzard developer decided to put some seriously spooky music in this house, so whenever you walk in it you just get the feeling that something is wrong, and then you go upstairs and see this and you just don't really want to be there anymore. In fact though, this allegedly wasn't meant to be some kind of reference to a horror movie or anything of the sort, but instead an inside joke between different development teams. And the names of all these kids formed Blizzard's dungeon department employees. And they added these spooky sounds and evil references just as a part of this inside joke. But they must have had a pretty funny sense of humor, because if you accidentally run into this place in game, it's gonna freak you out quite a bit. Next has to be one of the most hidden quests that's available within the game. For one of the larger reasons is that it is Horde only. And the reason this quest is so rare is the item to start it just has an extremely low drop rate. But if you do manage to pick this up on a regular playthrough without needing to grind through it excessively, it does lead to a fairly good quest chain. So it's a quest item called the Flayed Demon Skin, which is looted from members of the Burning Blade in Desolace, and it starts off a quest to investigate the demon threat within the zone. After doing your investigation, collecting several items, it then has you finally defeat Lord Azrithok, an elite, as well as Juggar Grimrod, an Orc Warlock, who are both found towards the south of Desolace. You've probably seen these two NPCs a bunch when you're questing in the area, and everyone's just trying to avoid them and not kill them for a change. So if you've ever wondered who would actually want to kill them for a quest, this is your answer, but it's Horde only, and the drop rate to actually get on the quest is really bad. Let's move over from a Horde exclusive thing to an Alliance exclusive thing. You'll have seen the staunch Dwarven Guard Mountaineer Pebblebitty. She's found in southern Lochmadan and is guarding a gate which is under lock and key to get into Searing Gorge, and she's particularly keen in her work that nobody is going to be getting into Searing Gorge under any circumstance possible. She is a dwarf with a serious attitude, but there are some extra interactions here which you have probably missed. If you go to her first of all before killing the elite in Searing Gorge to start the quest to get the key, she will actually give you a tip-off of where to find the NPC, saying there's a lady almost as tough as her in the gorge, and if you bring her some proof, she will see what she can do about getting you a key. But when you go and slay the beast and bring the proof back to Mountaineer Pebblebitty, well, it's just not good enough. She straight up doesn't believe you, and you have to take the horn and go all the way to Ironforge, get it authenticated, and then come back, and then she will give you a key. And even then she's pretty reluctant about giving you the key. However, since Blizzard knew they made this NPC a pain to deal with, they very much anticipated the player may be a bit rude to her. And if you go and try that emote out, she's gonna have a few extra words for you, saying you're pushing it, she's gonna beat some manners into you, or even she's about to go medieval on you. Just a bit of a fun extra interaction with an NPC, which you may or may not have known was there. Next is a real quick one, but it's always a fun one to know about if you haven't seen it before. But if you look into the cockpit of a Goblin Shredder, you can see a picture of one of the main characters from StarCraft, Sarah Kerrigan, the Queen of Blades, right on the panel at the front. And Blizzard love to reference their other games within their other games all the time. In fact, they even reference some of their earliest stuff possible. The three dwarves inside of Alderman aren't just an optional boss for the Horde and a bit of flavor text for the Alliance, but they're also referenced to a much earlier title. This was all the way back when Blizzard was known as Silicon and Synapse. And that's to one of their earliest games, simply known as the Lost Vikings. But that's not the only Easter egg here, as the two key pieces you'll assemble from next to the Lost Dwarves, as well as from defeating a near boss, are called the Shaft of Sol and the Amulet of Nekev. And if you spell it out a bit more clearly and reverse their words, you get Lost and Viking backwards. Oh, and then the set piece just afterwards where you put the staff together and then you put it in the hole which summons the light beam across the miniature city to summon the boss. This is a rather similar scene to an Indiana Jones film in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Can't really show it for copyright reasons, of course, but if you look it up, you'll see what I mean. There's a reference within a reference within a reference here. Classic Blizzard. Next is one which you will have heard in part more than likely. The extra audio in the Undercity throne room has to be one of the most famous Easter eggs in World of Warcraft. And if you haven't heard this before, you're in for a bit of a treat here. But even if you have heard it, I think there is more to it than you've probably heard. And I find that people may not really know that the sound and world design in World of Warcraft, the mmorpg, both mimic the infamous scene of Arthas's return home to Lordaeron to a greater extent than what you'd think. So let's take it from the start, towards the entrance of the Undercity. As you enter, the bells which once rang overhead, letting all know that the prince had returned, now lay silent and broken, with one of them being smashed into the ground. And the ambience itself here is an uneasy mess of ringing noises with voices mixed in between. This honestly wouldn't sound out of place in Silent Hill 2. You cross the area with the bells into the main open pathway, where the folk of Lordaeron would have watched over from the rafters with cheer and applause lighting up the air. But when you cross over it now in the Undercity, the cheers almost fade into a boo as you progress across your path towards the final room. And as you look down, you can still see the petals which rain down upon Arthas as he made his return that fateful day. As you approach the final door, the cheers bizarrely resume after being a boo as he walked through the central area. It's almost like that moment Arthas pauses in the courtyard to reflect before carrying on. It's like here he's being encouraged by the crowd to do what he's about to do. And finally, the famous throne room voices from the past, where echoes of times long gone can still be heard as clearly as ever, and King Terenas' blood still remains on the floor. This was definitely an epic moment within the RTS games, and it's good to see so much of it recreated here in the MMO. That isn't all for the Undercity though, as just in the main courtyard outside, there's seemingly nothing there. But if you were to send off a few AoE attacks, you're gonna find yourself quickly under attack. That's because there are a bunch of level 50 or so ghosts in this place called Unseen. Just be careful if you're on a hardcore character here, don't go randomly spamming AoE, that's gonna be a real fast ticket back to your starter zone. There is in fact another place with invisible ghosts in the game at Ravenhill in Duskwood. Here the ghosts are all over the buildings that circle the areas. As with the ones in the Undercity, them being level 50 and in a relatively safe zone make them quite ideal for farming soul shards on warlocks. I know when I used to play on a PvP server, I used to go to Ravenhill to farm shards before raid all of the time. I totally didn't end up joining AV and going to farm the mine for a bag full of shards. That would be very irresponsible. Next I have a 2-for-1 for you, and this is one which I just kept doing digging on and finding more and more information about it. So first of all, we have a gnome on an island by herself, just secluded with no real purpose in the game. Her name is Winky and she's off the southeastern coast of Tanaris, whose only dialogue includes words such as, "Mind rubbing some lotion on my exposed areas." Not the kind of dialogue you'd find at WoW today, that's for sure. She has been there since vanilla existed and has just kind of been chilling on her island forever and ever with no real purpose or rewards within the game. It's just a gnome having a good time, and who can blame her? If we were then to go off into the coast, into the sea, far into the fatigue zone, sort of just south of where the big circle is on the map, you'll run across a small gnomish ruin, which people often call Gnome Atlantis. It's a bunch of mechanical units, machines and houses which are leagues under the sea for no real good reason. And as with Winky, despite being a cool little thing in the game, they didn't have any purpose. But, and I'd be willing to bet these two pieces of content went the longest in the game between being released and actually being used in one way or another. Anyways, 12 years later, after both of these pieces of content were in the game, they finally gained a use at the start of Legion. As an engineer, you're sent to Winky to uncover the origins of the now famous Blingtron bot, a reoccurring item for many expansions now. It turns out that Winky's father was the creator of the bot, and his workshop was lost at sea when the tides rose up and submerged it. Do you want to guess where this is going? So you swim out to those ruins which have been in the sea in a fatigue zone since vanilla, and you recover some vital schematics and continue onwards on your quest. Talk about finally finding a way to fit some content into the game. Absolute props to whichever Blizzard dev remembered about this one. But I just think it's fun, and it does show how there's so much extra stuff in vanilla which could have a use eventually, even if it takes 12 years to do so. Another location which is a bit out of the way is in Duskwood. Nowadays it's a little more well known because I believe it's been used for a number of runes in Season of Discovery. It is a nice touch that they send you to some more hidden areas and have used them though. But since vanilla, players have been speculating who this memorial is for. After all, something this grand is usually for a person of grand stature in life, but nothing ever came to light about this from Blizzard or the players digging for information. However, during Cataclysm, Blizzard added a new NPC in front of this memorial, or perhaps more fittingly, a tomb, and this NPC was named the Unknown Soldier. Perhaps this was always the intention for this area as a secluded and quiet area in the zone of Duskwood, but the real-life reference to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is as clear as day. Next for you, I have riding in vanilla, because learning to ride in vanilla was completely different to any other expansion. First of all, in vanilla, training was the expensive part and the mounts themselves were dirt cheap, and each individual race also had their own mount riding skill too. You didn't just learn how to ride once and it worked for all mounts. For example, dwarves had ram riding, orcs had wolf riding, trolls had raptor riding, and so on. And of course, learning how to ride a different race's mount meant you also had to get exalted with them, on top of having to pay the huge cost to learn their riding skill. This meant if you ever saw a player with a different race's mount in vanilla to their own, it meant something, as they would have really had to gone out their way to grind for that. There were also certain race restrictions on who could use mounts. Only dwarves and gnomes could pilot mechanostriders, and on the Horde, Tauren could not learn to use raptors or undead horses. This was some pure RPG flavor from Blizzard, as races who are that towering and large just wouldn't fit onto those smaller mounts. But wait, there is more, as some mounts didn't need riding skill whatsoever, making them prestigious to see, as well as saving you some 900 gold or so for your epic mount. Those were the ZG mounts, the Azulian Tiger and Rizashi Raptor, and Death Charger's reigns from Baron Rivendare in Strat Undead. There were also the AV Exalted mounts as well, and the AV Exalted mounts weren't exactly as prestigious or as rare because you could really get AV Exalted in the space of a weekend if you wanted to, and it was a good way to save a bunch of gold to get 100% speed mount as well. And finally, there is one mount in the game which is probably the rarest and least used mount in vanilla, simply because people don't realize that it exists, and that is the Black Stallion, which is exclusively available from a mount vendor in Menethil Harbor in the wetlands. The annoying thing here is there's no riding trainer, so when you hit level 40 on a human, you still have to go all the way over to Eastvale logging camp to train your riding, but then you'd have to come back here and fly up to Menethil Harbor and then buy your horse at this location. That's kind of why nobody ends up doing this. But hey, maybe the next time you hit 40 on your human in vanilla, go buy your riding, then come over here and get a horse which is gonna stand out. Next up, class trainers. Typically when you want to go to them, you go to your capital city because you know you're going to be able to find them there. But there are also a bunch of class trainers which are dotted around the open world. You have a paladin trainer in Theramore, you have the rogue trainer in Booty Bay, I'm sure we've all seen him, but the zone with the most hidden trainers is Ashenvale, which for some reason has two separate hunter trainers, and the most hidden one of them is just beyond the Shrine of Asina, called Alendar Lapidar, as well as the pet trainer Bolyon. They're in a small camp up a hill and are super easy to miss unless you have a bit of an eagle eye, pun intended I suppose. It's always nice to have training options in the world, and it might just save you a trip back to Darnassus, so don't forget they're there next time you're in Ashenvale. I've also got a bit of bonus information for the elves of this camp. The leatherworker supplier just next to them is the only place in the game to buy the herbalist glove pattern, which are a level 22 pair of gloves that increase your herbalism skill by +5. The Horde does not have an equivalent to this, so if you wanted to get them you'd have to buy them and then trade them through the neutral auction house to get hold of them. I do think it's quite nice having some bonus herb skill when you're training, especially paired with the enchant. It can make those level breakpoints just so much easier to get through. Of course they're leather though, so clothies won't be able to use them. This is typical vanilla RPG. Would you go out in real life wearing gloves made of cloth to pick flowers? Of course not, you'd wear something thicker, like leather. The world of vanilla WoW has always been massive. Each of Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms individually contain more land than you'll find in most expansions, and that massive world has always played into vanilla's strengths in terms of exploration, scale, and of course the journey. But it was meant to be even larger than what shipped in 2004, as well as what we ended up replaying when Classic dropped in 2019, and by quite a big margin at that. In fact, the scope of what the devs wanted to put in the game went well beyond vanilla. Content that ended up being in TBC and even Wrath were already considerations from the very start of this game. Because of this, we're left with tons of, well, leftovers, placeholders if you will, closed off areas where ideas were supposed to be, and entire zones that we would never fully see release as well. And that is really what I want to talk about today. 10 locations or zones that you were never really supposed to see in vanilla. Whether they were unfinished, unused, or just hidden away, there is going to be plenty to cover here, So let's make a start. The first one up is one you will have probably seen if you've played hardcore on Alliance, as running past it was popularized by a no-def Dumero to wetland skip, which would save you a ton of time, and meant you didn't need to risk the Crocolisk gauntlet that is the wetlands. And I'm talking about the hidden dwarven farm way up in the hills overlooking the wetlands. It's strange that there is the making of a path to get here through a tunnel, but there's just nothing connected to the other side of it where you'd ever be able to get here in a normal way. But this area is complete with crops and farmers working away about their business. It's definitely not the only thing hidden on top of the mountain above Ironforge, the most notorious other one being the Dwarven Airport, but everyone gets a pretty good view of that when you're taking a flight path down to Menethil Harbour. It's just a cool little find that people somehow ran into exploring zones over the years, and it's a nice surprise when you're first making that skip between those two zones. It's this kind of hidden away thing that really makes you want to go into every nearby building in the zone and just see if there's anything else to find, and that's really why I wanted to give it a mention. Staying with the dwarves, the next one is inside Ironforge itself, and it's simply known as Old Ironforge. The most common way that people would get here is having another player use a fear or a disorient effect on them right next to the doorway where the king is, and then you could clip through it if the pathing went well. But you can also get here solo. If you manage to parkour on top of the big safe at the back of the bank in Ironforge, and then use an effect on you which increases your character's size, such as Winterfall Firewater, Elixir of Giant Growth, that kind of thing, and then you log out and in, you should clip through the wall at the top and be able to drop down into this zone. Results may vary based on your character model if you try this, by the way. Some races clip through things better than others. Anyways, Old Ironforge is a small sub-zone of Ironforge with a narrow tunnel leading down to it. Inside there's a huge crystal roof above and almost like a small throne area, as well as a path that leads all the way down to two more locked doors. And there's loads of lava in there as well, just for good measure. Of course, in Cataclysm this area is now fully open, so you can just head right in there and check it out easily enough. And to be honest, it's not all that much different from how it was beforehand, apart from Magni now being trapped in there until he eventually awakened in a later expansion to inform us all that we needed to heal Azeroth's wounds.
Can you find a way to heal Azeroth?
Moving on though, there are also some pretty big chunks of the map in vanilla which just have nothing there, and are kept away from the view of players via several mountains or obstacles, despite in many cases being shown on the map as a zone. One of these is just to the north of Stormwind, in the west of Burning Steppes, and the south of Dun Morogh. It's a huge open space which, to be honest, could have quite easily been a zone in its own right, perhaps some kind of mid-level zone given where it is located in the world, and maybe even a continuation of the Burning Steppes all the way down to the sea to the west. In Cataclysm, when Blizzard updated the world map because, well, they gave everyone flying, they couldn't leave these as blank spaces, they more or less just filled this subzone up with water and said, yep, that looks good, on to the next one. They probably had enough to do with Cata with the new zones alongside basically redesigning the whole questing experience from vanilla in the first place, so it is understandable. But maybe one day this zone that's hidden away could be something more. But when it comes to unused zones, the largest by some margin is towards the north of the Eastern Kingdoms. Spanning the whole way from Tirisfal Glades over to the Eastern Plaguelands is an absolutely massive empty area. In fact, most of the actual eastern side of the Eastern Kingdoms has an empty area all the way around it, with the zone name simply being the Forbidding Sea. It's big areas like this which someday I hope to see filled out on some kind of Classic Plus version of the game. Of course, in the Burning Crusade, this whole area was fully used as the home for the Blood Elves, complete with their starting zone, capital, Silvermoon City, as well as the Ghostlands. But even in vanilla, there are some vaguely elven remnants of a ruin alongside the coastline far to the north, way beyond what any player would be able to get to easily. This contains a few buildings which wouldn't look out of place if they were in Darnassus, and perhaps even show us that maybe there were already plans for this area to be used as early as vanilla. But as with many other things, it just didn't fit into the scope of everything that they wanted to achieve in such a short space of development time. Staying on the trend of what was started but not finished in vanilla is the Greymane Wall in southern Silverpine Forest. This is one of those rare occasions where we do more or less have the full story of what was going to be happening here too. So the story goes, as the Scourge were closing in on the city of Gilneas, King Gen Greymane called upon Archmage Aragorn to find a way to defend against this unstoppable enemy. So the Archmage mage called upon his knowledge of a mysterious and ferocious beast known as the Worgen, saying that he could summon them into Azeroth to defend the kingdom, and the king agreed. Though the Worgen were successful in stopping the scourge, they then began to turn on the Gilnean soldiers and began spreading the Worgen curse. Blaming himself for this, Aragorn went mad with grief and locked himself away in Shadowfang Keep as seemingly the only one able to control the Worgen. As for Gilneas, it was deemed cursed and locked away so that none could enter or escape from this doomed city. And that's where the Greymane Wall comes in for Classic, a massive gate that will lead to the city of Gilneas, or that's what we assumed at least. If you were to parkour your way in pre-Kata, there is a rather less than impressive bunch of absolute nothing there, a blank canvas ready to one day become the Worgen cursed city that it was destined to be. In fact, if you look at the map in vanilla, there's both the visible part where the city of Gilneas would have been, which you can clearly see, as well as a zone to the south of that where in-game there's actually nothing whatsoever, suggesting that there were definitely plans to really build this zone out and make it into something, but as it quite often was with vanilla, they just didn't manage to finish this project in time. Next up, we're heading much further south in the Eastern Kingdoms, all the way down to Deadwind Pass. Deadwind Pass has always had this mysterious aura to it, a huge zone which you occasionally pass through between Duskwood and the Swamp of Sorrows whilst trying to dodge getting eaten by a vulture, and there are also some ogres there which drop a bracer enchant for superior strength, so even in vanilla there is technically some content there, just not much. But what I want to touch on here isn't actually the Karazhan crypts, despite that being probably the most well-known thing about this zone, because how Karazhan itself was in the World of Warcraft Alpha looked different, like really different. From the outside there is a giant drawbridge that leads into the main part of the tower, and on the inside, whilst it has a very basic texture layered on the whole thing, it's actually quite built out. There are winding corridors, stairs leading up to levels, and even ways to loot back on outside again. Even at this super early stage of World of Warcraft, there had been quite a bit of work done on making Karazhan into something which players could visit. And something else to note here is at this point Karazhan was not an instance, and whilst it may have well planned to be in the future, instead here it was more of an open world point of interest. Perhaps it was more intended to be kind of the ultimate mage tower on Azeroth, which would at least fit in lore-wise. I mean, there are already plenty of mage towers throughout the human kingdom, such as in Elwyn or Redridge Mountains, and Deadwind isn't too far off from those lands either, so I don't think it's too much of a stretch of the imagination. Of course, Karazhan and Deadwind Pass as a whole, I suppose, is definitely an area which I'd love to see expanded upon one day if Blizzard ever does this whole Classic Plus thing. It did end up becoming a legendary raid in TBC, as well as being brought back as a two-part dungeon in Legion, and on top of that they even used some of the areas below Karat for artifact weapon quests in Legion, such as the Scythe of Elune for boomies. Either way, it's a very cool place in the alpha as well as vanilla. It has such a reputation for a reason, and that's why I wanted to mention it here. Next is another place that was brought into the game officially in the Burning Crusade, but is very much there already in vanilla, and that is the Caverns of Time all the way over in Tanaris. With some creative parkour, it is possible to get in towards the top of the giant stone which is blocking the way in, and beyond that you have the familiar trail that leads all the way down into the caverns themselves. Down here things change entirely from the outside. The skybox becomes something from outer space, and from a giant hourglass shape, sand continually falls. Quite a few of the assets down here were also finished during vanilla, including much of the environment and the layout that would end up being used later on. There are even instance portals for what would become Assault on Mount Hyjal, Escape from Durnhold Keep, and the Black Morass in TBC. It's kind of surprising just how much of this subzone really is intact at this super early stage of the game, though at the end of the day this place is basically just a hub for various different instances, in this case telling stories from the past, and since none of those instances were fully completed in vanilla, it's reasonable that the caverns remained closed. Nevertheless, it's definitely an interesting place to see and visit within the game. In fact, there's even what is assumed to be some early work for Outland in vanilla. It's just very well hidden, and how somebody ever found this is truly a miracle. If you jump on the pipe at the start of the dead mines and move to the left hand side of it, and then use a consumable to increase your character's size, log out and in, and you should be able to clip through the wall a little bit. At this point you need to use some kind of slow fall and movement speed effect to land in the nearby water, and then follow the wall all the way around for a few minutes, and eventually you'll arrive at a rather strange place. Here there are loads of floating trees on top of crystals, which is kind of reminiscent of how Nagrand ended up being an Outland. Although during the early stages of WoW there was also a Hellfire Peninsula zone which was being worked on, which had trees that were very similar to this, but you won't be able to go and see that in the game by yourself. There were also a number of purple bubbles, or a kind of spell effect around the area, which were more or less identical to the magical barrier that's covering Dalaran. I guess the developer was working on some early assets for a zone and thought they would be safely hidden away miles from anywhere inside of an instance, but World of Warcraft players somehow just find a way. Next is for one you won't be able to visit in-game unfortunately, but the assets exist so players have uncovered it, and this is for one of Vanilla's unreleased battlegrounds, the Ashara Crater. There was more than one vanilla battleground that was cancelled, and this isn't to be confused with Kaladar, which is the MOBA style battleground that you often hear about. Ashara Crater was much closer to how Alterac Valley ended up being. In fact, Ashara Crater was put on the back burner because getting Alterac Valley working and balanced was seen as more of a priority, but then it just never ended up being released itself. But both the battleground map and the zone had quite a bit of work done on it. Where it's different to Alterac Valley is that both factions started really close to one another instead of being at opposite sides of the map. You pretty much ran out of your base area under a huge stone archway and you would have already been seeing other faction players. There are also so many objectives in between which would have influenced the map in some way you have to imagine. You have a submerged ruin near the center, which reminds me of the entrance to BFD. You have what looks like a moonwell, a whole Firbolg cave over to the side of the zone, some kind of shadowy elven ruin, and there's even a full-on barrow den near one of the bases as well. You do wonder if this existed these days, whether people would just be trying to zerg the last boss and end the game as soon as possible, in a similar way to what's happened with Alterac Valley over time. All the same, I think this is an interesting map to check out, and maybe something which we could see for real one day in the future. Last but not least, we have a zone which has finally made its way into World of Warcraft during more recent expansions, but it is another place which has been there since vanilla. Similar to the Ashara Crater, there's no official way to get there in-game, but here I am talking about the Emerald Dream. The Emerald Dream itself is available in the game files and is broadly separated out into two subzones, the Verdant Fields and the Emerald Forest. There's two things that really strike me about this zone more than anything else. One, it is massive. Seriously, this place would have been the biggest zone in the game by a mile. You just keep going and there's just more of it and more of it, and then you think it ends and there's another hill in the distance which you can go to. It really feels like it never ends. And the second thing is it's very green, which I suppose shouldn't come as much of a surprise. As for the landscape, it's for the most part pretty basic, with huge flowers and fields as far as the eye can see. At one point there's even some strange statue halfway out the ground, and some elven looking things nearby. Not entirely sure what these are meant to be, but it does look as though it was the start of something. Tigol, that's Jeff Kaplan, even made a few comments about the dream towards when World of Warcraft was entering its beta phase, saying things such as, "I was running around in the Emerald Dream last Thursday, you guys are in for a treat. The level designers are doing a killer job. The Emerald Dream is shaping up to be extremely cool. We don't want to preview any of that content yet as it is endgame, and we want some surprises for players. The zone is massive and beautiful, and once the content team is done with it, it will be exceedingly challenging." But it never made it into the game as a fully finished zone, despite the intent having been there. Chris Metzen commented on the Emerald Dream at BlizzCon 2013 a bit more, saying, "The Emerald Dream is a nice idea, and the team has talked about making it into an expansion many times. Building an entire expansion worth of zones around a green lush forest theme would get very boring, so the Emerald Dream would be better used as a raid, a dungeon, or a subzone, not an entire expansion." And they did deliver on that, eventually. The Emerald Dream would definitely still have tons of work to be done to it in a vanilla setting, but who knows, one day we could see what it would have looked like. The classes in the world of vanilla Warcraft truly stand out from other versions of the game. They were from a time when the game was approached very differently, and getting those small incremental upgrades to your class as a whole just felt so good to do. Whether it was learning a brand new spell for the first time and going out to test it, getting a new rank of an ability, or unlocking your all-important level 40 talents such as Mortal Strike, Shadow Form, Bestial Wrath, or more. There's so much to like about how the classes ended up being in vanilla. It may not always be the most convenient that your class doesn't excel at everything and feels as though it can't do everything, but it certainly makes things feel unique. Still, classes changed a bunch from World of Warcraft's alpha to its eventual release in 2004, and today I wanted to show you a few obscure or perhaps lesser known things about each of vanilla's classes so you can really get an idea of just how different things ended up being. With that said, here's a few facts about each of vanilla's classes that you may or may not have known about. Let's start off with a mage today, and mages used to have even better utility than what they ended up shipping with. It's crazy to think you have a class here that can make their own food and water, mana gems, portals, and teleport, and it used to be even better than that utility wise. Mages used to be able to do lockpicking as well, and this was called Khadgar's unlocking, where they would conjure different ranks of keys that would be able to open different level chests and doors. Though this was removed sometime during the alpha, and I suppose Blizzard decided that some other classes should be able to do some things as well, maybe such as a rogue for lockpicking for example. Mages used to have 2 ranks of an invisibility spell as well, which will last for a long time but could randomly end early. Obviously a mage popping out of nowhere in invisibility, then pompiring you or polymorphing you to enter combat would be seriously overpowered as well. So this ability was eventually removed, but it did make a comeback in TBC and beyond in a bit more of a balanced way. Mages also had an ability called Phantasm. They got a new rank of this every 8 levels, starting at level 14 and ending at 38. This would summon a sort of ghost which would go and attack people, which is a bit of an odd addition for the Mage's toolkit and is another one that was removed pre-launch. For priests, at one point during the WoW alpha, they used to have a long duration CC effect called Sleep, and in fact there was a bit of a back and forth between them having this ability and mages having it as their long duration CC instead of polymorph. Sleep started off as a priest ability and then was moved to mage, and then was later moved back to priest, at which point mages were given polymorph, but then of course as we now know from launch, Sleep was eventually moved from the priest class as well. But this is why you see certain NPCs who are associated with priests or maybe paladins casting Sleep within the game, and instead priests would have CC effects such as mind control and shackle undead, which lasted for a long time. Discipline was also kind of a weird caster melee hybrid in its very early versions, kind of like a holy monk which would fight with their fists but also cast a bunch of spells. And if you check out a really early version of the discipline tree, it kind of makes sense. They have a lot of things which are instant cast or reduce the mana cost of their instant casts, or focus a bit more on priest's utility such as dispelling or burning mana. And the final talent point in this tree used to be Divine Spirit before it was revamped later on to be more of a traditional caster type healer. Whilst the idea was there for them to be somewhat melee and maybe even to tank to some extent due to the extra threat from Mind Blast, there was no real support added in for melee abilities, so I think this idea was canned pretty early on. In a very early version of Warlock, instead of their imp having Flame Shield, which of course reflects minor damage onto an enemy, instead they had Flame Blade, and you'd imagine they'd have conjured up a sword and then gone to hit something with it, which does sound kind of cool to be honest, but I guess this would have meant your imp would have been going into melee range to use it, and your imp already kind of dies to any damage whatsoever, so this probably wouldn't have been for the best. Also in vanilla, I can't help but get that feeling as though some of the higher level Warlock demons are a bit underused. For example, when your Infernal summoned, it's not under your control and you have to subjugate it. On the unofficial hardcore servers, people used to go around griefing with this. They'd go over to Elwyn Forest, drop an Infernal on someone's head, and there's not really that much you can do about it. Equally, the Doomguard was much more dangerous and needed 5 people to complete the ritual, one of whom would be sacrificed during the ritual. And whilst the Doomguard was quite powerful in vanilla, it was never really used for this reason, just because of the inconvenience of summoning it. Maybe one day we'll see a bit more utility from these high level demons for the Warlock. Also, you may not have known that whilst you can learn to summon these 2 demons from quests, you can also go and farm mobs out in the open world which will drop grimoires. The Infernal is dropped by Scarshield Warlocks, which are quite soloable by the way, and the Doomguard from the elite demons in Blasted Lands near where Kazakh is. These are not so soloable. Again, it's a bit of a shame that the high high level demons don't have more uses in the game. Maybe we'll see this change one day. Next up we have Druid, and did you know that Tranquility seemed to be a lot stronger once upon a time, as it would still be an ability with a long cooldown, but it had a 30-second duration, so you could really just plant a Druid somewhere, have them trank, and people's health will be good for so long. Also, their talent trees used to be very different. At the end of the restoration tree, instead of finding Swiftmend, you'd have Innovate there, and instead of Moonkin form as the final talent point for balance, you would have Hurricane, and it's the version of Hurricane that Vanilla shipped with, where frankly, it's not very good, mainly because it costs way too much mana and has a 1-minute cooldown. Imagine for a while during the WoW Alpha that Druid didn't even have Moonkin form. We really could have ended up with such a different game. For Rogue, they used to have a combo point builder witch stunned called Trip, which sounds hilariously not fun to play against. Also, if it's called Trip, it's probably some variation of a knockdown effect, which don't typically suffer from diminishing returns as other CC effects do due to the animation you have to go through. Imagine getting tripped up 5 times in a row straight into a kidney shot. You will literally not be able to play the game, even more so than you already can't versus rogues. And up to patch 0.8, rogues, and hunters for that matter, could use a smaller variation of a shield called a buckler, which was designed to give them extra defense and a bit more armor, but there was no real ability support from anything else they had in their toolkit, so it was eventually removed. On this same patch, bucklers were removed entirely and just all replaced with shields, and shields were also enabled for Shaman. For the hunter, survival used to be a melee focused talent tree all the way down. There were talents which gave loads of bonuses to melee stats, reduced cooldowns, extra hit chance, extra crit chance, all of that good stuff. And their final talent was Lacerate, which is basically the same as Rend, it's just an ability you press and it puts a bleed on the enemy. And if it's anything like Rend, or well, just other bleeds in Classic in general, then it wouldn't have really scaled with anything and would have been absolutely terrible. In fact, this whole melee identity for the hunter back then, I have to imagine, was absolutely terrible, especially when you compare it to its ranged counterparts. Until we got to Legion, that is, and then Blizzard changed survival into a melee spec once again, and they even brought back Lacerate, working pretty much in the same way that it did during the WoW Alpha, and then they ended up removing Lacerate again in BFA. I guess hunters just can't have this ability. During the WoW Alpha, hunters used to have way more abilities too, such as Running Shot, which, as the name suggests, is a shot that you could use whilst moving, or Blinding Shot, which would reduce enemies' hit chance for a short duration. I think in the end Blizzard pruned down a lot of these extra abilities just to try and simplify the class. Hunter, despite its simple appearance, can be, at least I find, one of the classes you need a few more keybinds on. The Shaman had some crazy different abilities pre-launch. One of them was Serpent Totem that would summon a totem that would attack nearby enemies. Judging from the icon here, this was eventually changed into Flame Tongue Totem, and having a fire-based totem that attacks nearby enemies sounds a lot like your regular old Searing Totem. Then again, different races within the game have always had slightly different totems. Maybe it would be nice if one day you can customize them a little bit more than that. Shamans also had Molten Blast, which is notably a spell which we've had return in Season of Discovery, but in a different way I think. This version of Molten Blast just looked like a single target spell which did some minor fire damage, though it could have been early inspiration for what Lava Burst eventually became in Wrath of the Lich King. And Shamans also had Lightning Storm that would do AoE damage in an area. This was possibly replaced by Chain Lightning, though I'm not 100% sure if they already had this ability. Functionally, it seems quite similar to what Hurricane would have already been for Balance Druids, which was already a capstone talent, remember, so I guess Blizzard didn't want to have two classes doing more or less the exact same AoE nature damage spell. Paladins used to be so different in the earlier versions of World of Warcraft. Blessing of Kings, for example, used to be the final talent point in the Retribution tree. Repentance still existed too, and there was the final point for protection. Imagine if vanilla shipped with Ret being the only spec which could access Blessing of Kings. Retribution Paladins would be an absolutely mandatory one of in every single raid. Also, Consecration used to be in the Retribution tree as well. You used to be able to buff seals on other players during the WoW Alpha, and your Judgment ability did exist, but it was a lot more similar to what Holy Wrath ended up being. And also for Paladins, Greater Blessings didn't exist until patch 1.9. That's when AQ was released. So up to then, all they had was 5-minute blessings in a 40-player raid environment. You were truly playing the buff of a people class, put it like that. And last but not least, we have the Warrior. Bloodthirst was the final talent for Fury, but it was very different from the ability you know. It made your your next attack to 100% bonus damage after landing a killing blow. This would have been interesting to try and min-max and make the most of in PvE, and in PvP you'd probably be one-shotting clothies with this proc up, or near enough. Enrage in the Fury tree, interestingly, would also give a bonus 40% to physical damage after receiving a crit, which is a pretty massive number. Up to patch 0.10, which is pretty late in the alpha by the way, charge was still usable in combat. Warriors nearly lived in a world where you could charge in combat and you had intercept. This would have been an absolutely massive buff for them, of course. And your final talent in the protection tree was also quite different, and you didn't have shield slam. Instead you had shield discipline, which cost 15 rage, had a 20-second duration and a 45-second cooldown. It increased the damage absorbed by your shield by 50% and increased the damage of shield bash by 200%. And on paper this sounds pretty good, but shield bash is your interrupt ability, remember, and it does kind of, well, next to no damage. So next to nothing times 200% is still pretty much next to nothing. Also in vanilla, shields absorbed a flat amount of damage, not a percentage. So if you're fighting a boss, your shield's damage absorption was doing pretty much nothing. However, if you were fighting lots of low-level enemies or enemies which hit fast and did a little bit of damage, it was very good. Unfortunately, when shields mattered most of the time, you'd be fighting bosses, which ultimately made them not great. Ultimately, Blizzard would remove this talent and replace it with shield slam, but as we now know today, the protection tree, when it comes to tanking, still just isn't very good. Turns out you need to do a lot of damage to generate threat in vanilla, and the protection tree does not encourage you to do that. Imagine it's sometime in late 2003 during the World of Warcraft Friends and Family Alpha. The current patch is 0.5.3. Rogues and hunters are not playable in the game yet, nor are night elves or even most of the horde races. Talent trees are a thing that few classes have, and World of Warcraft's many classes are still taking shape, whether that's directly on the alpha or behind the scenes. And these classes are vastly different in so many ways compared to what we got on the final launch date of November 2004, and a bunch of them went through dozens of iterations and changes before they were ready to ship. So today I wanted to cover some of the abilities which existed during this super early stage of World of Warcraft but never made it to live. And even if you're a die-hard World of Warcraft fan, I bet you'll still hear of some abilities which you never knew existed in this video, because this alpha patch of World of Warcraft had some truly wacky additions which would have made certain classes absolutely insane. So with all that said, let's make a start. Today we'll begin with the cloth wearers and work our way up the armor types, I think, and we'll begin with the priest. The first ability I want to cover for them is called Dominate. It's basically what mind control ended up being, but instead of it being a channel, it's a 3-second cast and otherwise has a similar effect. It also mentions the target has a chance to break free every 5 seconds, which is essentially what Heartbeat Resists ended up being, where periodically the game will check if a long duration CC will end early. And I do believe even during this early stage of the game, this was a system that existed. It does have a long cast time, but it goes without saying that this would have been incredibly powerful if the priest was able to maintain a mind control and act themselves. So I'm not surprised this was later changed into how mind control would work. We also have 2 utility shadow word effects, both of which were removed from the game. The first is Befuddle, which slowed enemy casting speeds, and I believe this slow is a 65% reduction for 30 seconds with no cooldown. So that is Curse of Tongues on hyper steroids basically. They also had Shadow Word Fumble, which reduced the chance to hit by 75% for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Back then, spell hit and physical hit were different stats too, so essentially there was one Shadow Word to mess up casters and one for physical damage dealers. Both effects sound pretty not fun to play versus in PvP, and if you think about it, how many spell effects are there that reduce the player's hit chance? I guess it was decided that hit was to be mainly a PvE stat, and as a result abilities like Fumble shouldn't exist. Also, if you had 6 priests, which is pretty doable in a 40-man raid if you really wanted to, you could permanently debuff every single boss in the game with a minus 75% hit chance, which would totally break the majority of encounters, so I'm not surprised this one got removed. As for Befuddle, a no cooldown 30-second duration minus 65% cast speed debuff would just be overpowered beyond belief. Imagine priests in Battlegrounds just being able to spam this on anyone. Yeah, that would have been a bit too good. Next up is Mage, and they have to be one of the most changed classes throughout the alpha, as I've seen so far, and the first ability I want to highlight for them is Counterspell, but a very different counterspell to how you know it usually works. During this early stage of the game, it was a 1 minute cooldown ability, which would stop an enemy from casting their next spell for 1 minute. So basically, you counterspell somebody, they'd use their Frostbolt for instance if they were an enemy mage, and then they couldn't Frostbolt again for an entire minute. So if you caught somebody using a very important spell, Counterspell would be absolutely devastating. Mages also had Summon Water Elemental too as their big cooldown. I'm not sure what its abilities would have been, but probably some kind of water bolt at least, you would imagine. It was removed later as Mage was not deemed a pet class, but of course this ability would make a return in the Burning Crusade as the capstone talent for Frost. Finally, mages had invisibility, both lesser and regular. No cooldown, 3-second cast, but the spell could randomly end early. So hypothetically, mages would be able to near enough permanently be invisible. That would have pushed their power level, especially in open world PvP, to crazy levels, and it's probably not balanceable as a permanent effect. But of course, again, this was brought back in TBC in a more balanced version. I think the fact that Warlock has spells like Detect Lesser Invisibility and Invisibility showed the in-game rivalry between the two classes. I mean, if you talk to a Warlock trainer as a Warlock, they've clearly got some beef with mages, it's well known. As such, Warlocks trained themselves to be able to detect mages who were invisible, and they had demons such as the Fell Hunter, who could dispel, had spell lock and very high spell resist to counter casters. Either way, mages' invisibility didn't make it to live, but Warlock's detection of invisibility did, which ended up having some niche uses, such as detecting invisible mobs in Diamol West or Strat Undead, but during the alpha of World of Warcraft, invisibility was a bigger part of the game, so it seemed as though Warlocks were going to be the class to counter that, and that class flavour was at least kept for them, because as we'll see later on, there was going to be another class with invisibility, and I've kind of given it away already. Speaking of Warlock, we'll cover that next. First up is that Banish used to be a long duration CC effect, not something that's just used versus demons or elementals. In fact, the version of Banish which existed during this alpha patch may have been the most powerful CC effect ever in World of Warcraft. It was a 1-second cast, 30-second duration effect that would make the target immune but unable to act, and it also cost a soul shard. So it's basically Cyclone, but it has a 1-second cast and a 30-second duration. On top of that, and this is the really crazy bit, is this initial version of Banish was castable on multiple targets at the same time. If we check the wiki for patch 0.6, you can see here Banish was limited to 1 target max, and they also gave it a 30-minute cooldown for some reason. I'm not sure it was quite that powerful to need a 30-minute cooldown, but anyway, Banish was changed to what we know it is now just before the official launch. But this alpha version could take multiple targets out of the game for 30 seconds at a time in no time at all. Well, provided you'd farmed a bunch of soul shards, that is. Hellfire also used to be different and way stronger. It had a 3-second cast time and would last for 10 seconds, and similar to the version you know, would cause damage to both the Warlock and nearby enemies. So it was the same damage dealing effect, you just didn't have to channel it, so you could do Rain of Fire or whatever else you wanted whilst it was active. Also, it had the Death and Decay icon at this point in time, which kind of makes sense considering what it does too. Finally, Warlocks used to have Holy Ward instead of Shadow. I mean, I kind of get it, Warlocks are supposed to be opposite to the light, but at the same time there's basically next to no holy damage in the game, and there's a lot of shadow damage, so I get why this changed. Onto the level wearers next, and we'll begin with a Rogue. And Rogue definitely have some of the most interesting stuff out of any class. Did you know Rogues were the original transmog enjoyers thanks to their disguises? Disguises were a bunch of ways Rogues could learn to gain the appearances of various NPCs throughout the world, all of which needed one linen cloth and some kind of item associated with that NPC. For example, a Syndicate disguise needed a mark of the Syndicate, Dalaran Wizard a robe from them, the South Sea Pirate a deckhand shirt, and so on. I guess having a disguise would make you friendly to nearby enemies too, so you could very much hide in plain sight, until you can jump some poor opposite faction player who just never saw it coming. It seemed like a fun addition to the game, but was probably deemed a bit too niche in its uses, and Rogues did already have poisons and lockpicking for their their class fantasy points. And at the end of the day, if you did want to jump somebody on the enemy faction, you kind of have stealth, and that's pretty good already. The next one is something that I had no idea about at all. So during this early version of World of Warcraft, hunters didn't have feign death, but rogues did, and it was exactly the same spell hunters would eventually receive. The difference is, and this is very in line with rogue in vanilla, is that you needed a reagent called a death capsule to use feign death. This was made from deathweed, which would make it alive and is used for deadly poison and some other things. It fits the theme as the rogue is the master of deception that they would have a feign death type effect, and they also had vanish by this point in time too. Why was it removed? Well, this version of feign death, according to the tooltip at least, had no cooldown, and assuming it did drop combat, this would have made rogues be able to re-stealth basically whenever they want, which probably goes without saying would be unbelievably broken in PvP. And it wasn't just rogues that had feign death either, druids could also use this ability, except it was called play dead. Notably, it needed 50 energy to use, so that makes it a cat form ability. Again, this fits in with the more stealthy class identity that the druid have, being able to deceive their enemies. Would have been super useful to have this on druids for escaping bad situations really, but it ended up getting removed in patch 0.9. Druids also had a long duration CC effect called Bear Hug. This bear form ability would stun both the target and the druid for up to 30 seconds, or until the druid let go, or was CC'd I suppose. A 30-second stun in PvP has the potential to be truly ridiculous if nobody could CC the druid to get them off, and it would allow an ally to basically land a free kill on absolutely anyone. Then again, the druid themselves doesn't really have damage over time effects which they could let tick down in a solo fight during the stun, or should I say they did have some dots such as Rip and Rake, but they were just really bad. And bears also had bash at this point in time too, if you're wondering if Bear Hug got transformed into that ability, but I guess they got rid of Bear Hug because it would have been either kind of bad or extremely overpowered with basically no in between the two. Next for druids has to be one of the most weird abilities in this video, called Abolish Magic. It roughly matches the Dryad ability from Warcraft 3, and I imagine a bunch of these spells have some kind of inspiration from that game, but check this out. It's a no cooldown low mana cost instant cast which removes all magic effects from a friendly target and prevents any magic from affecting them for 5 seconds, instantly getting rid of all magical debuffs, which is what most debuffs are to be fair, would have been crazy good in PvP. Then again, it says removes all magical effects and prevents them for 5 seconds, so you could grief with this ability pretty easily. Somebody just buffed everyone at the start of a battleground, abolish those buffs right off. See a guy with magic dispellable world buffs? Not anymore, you don't. Mages getting hit and they want to ice block? You could abolish them. Ice block's a magic effect, so it wouldn't work. Abolish magic in the right scenario would have been such a powerful ability, but it would have been so easy to use it wrong and very griefable to be honest, so I'm not surprised they got rid of it. Next up we have our mail wearers, and we'll start with a shaman. So shaman had some of the most insanely broken abilities you will ever see in this game. Let's start with one that's a bit more on the tame side for them though, Thunderclap. Hey, it's that warrior ability, which when you think about it makes a whole lot of sense on a shaman, especially when they did have a bit of a tanking thing going on early in the game with the shield, the defensive talents, the bonus threat abilities, all of that. And at rank 2, Thunderclap was a 30-second cooldown ability which hit all nearby enemies for moderate damage and slowed their movement speed and attack speed by 40% for 10 seconds. It's a fairly long cooldown, but at the same time it's a very powerful debuff too. But at some point, as we well know, this ability was changed up a bit and moved over to warriors. Next up is Ethereal Form, and it's here where things start to get a little bit crazy. This is kind of a version of Divine Shield, aka Bubble, for the shaman. It was a 5-minute cooldown, 10-second duration effect that made you immune to physical damage, but also unable to use physical attacks. Another throwback from Warcraft 3, and an ability that was brought back in Legion as a PvP talent for Enhancement Shaman with a pretty similar effect. Situationally, this would have been extremely powerful. Imagine you're threatened by melee attackers, you press ethereal form, and then you just blast them with lightning bolts. Well, I suppose it was good if you're resto or elemental, otherwise as enhancement it would kind of just be something to get away. Last ability for Shaman is the Invisibility Totem, and yes, you did hear that right. It was a 5-minute cooldown, 1-minute duration effect that would turn all nearby group members invisible for its duration. So I guess Tauren rogues might not have been a thing back then, but Tauren could kind of make your party into rogues, well, at least for a minute or so. Imagine seeing a totem sitting there all by itself and then 5 people just appear out of it riding on Kodos and one-shot you. This totem would have been hilarious to see in the game and would have made for some great moments. At the same time, there would have been some very, let's say, creative uses for this, and it could have ended up being problematic perhaps. Either way, the invisibility totem didn't make it to live. Next is Hunter, and Hunter was the last class to be added in testing during the WoW beta in patch 0.9. The more you know, but we're talking about the alpha version of course before people even got their hands on it. Hunter pets used to have tons more abilities in this early stage of the game too. For example, Gorillas had Bruise, which was a variation of Sunder Armor, and Scorpids had Dig Trap. This would make them immobile and put them in stealth, and then if an enemy walked over where they were, it would attack them for bonus damage. To be fair, Hunter pets still had a lot of abilities when vanilla released, but they used to have way more. Hunters also had a lot more shot related abilities too, such as Explosive Shot. This version had a 1-minute cooldown, cost 4 focus, and dealt moderate damage to its primary target and AoE around them. I guess most people know this now, but Hunters did used to use focus before the release of WoW, and focus worked differently then. It wasn't similar to energy where it would just regenerate and you get some focus via steady shotting. It would only regenerate when you were standing still. I mean, how are you going to focus if you're running around everywhere? Makes sense, right? Hunters also had Silencing Shot, which costs 2 focus on a 1-minute cooldown and silence the target for 8 seconds. Imagine playing versus a 1-minute cooldown 8-second blanket silence. This ability would make a return in the Burning Crusade as the capstone talent for marksmanship, albeit it had been nerfed pretty heavily, but it's probably for the best that it didn't ship like this in vanilla. And finally, our big boy plate wearers, with the warrior up first. During this early version of WoW, Cleave used to have an attack speed slow on it in addition to its normal effects. Remember, if we're looking at the game through this snapshot, Shaman still had Thunderclap, so I suppose this was meant to be the warrior's attack speed debuff. Stances were quite different too. Battle stance would give you rage when you hit enemies or when you were hit. Zerka's stance would only give rage when you attacked enemies, and defensive stance would give you rage when you were hit in combat. The rage generation was probably pretty bad with this system if I had to guess, unless you just got a ton of rage for any action which landed. It's probably for the best that this system got reworked pre-launch though. In any case, warriors were definitely the least changed class from this early stage of alpha, and ultimately most of their abilities were just renamed but basically have always done the same thing. But if warriors were the least different, paladins were the most different by far. Back then, Crusader Strike existed of course, and it would stack a holy damage debuff on your target, and then you would deal your big hits of damage with Holy Strike. This was a next weapon attack which did bonus holy damage. Also, Judgment was in the game back then, but it was essentially what Holy Wrath was, in that it dealt damage to nearby enemies. As for your seals, they existed, but they were kind of all what blessings were, if that makes sense. Short duration buffs that you could cast on allies. For instance, Seal of Righteousness made attack deal bonus damage to the undead, and Sacrifice split 50% of damage with a paladin, which had a 30-second duration and no cooldown. Remember, these versions of seals were castable on allies, by the way. I'm pretty sure paladins would have been kind of average at dealing damage, but their utility would have been absolutely unreal, even though you'd need to track several seals on party members, each of which would have a different duration, and that probably would not have been the most fun thing to do. Eventually, of course, seals were made into a personal buff which were tied to a judgment effect, and the short duration buffs became blessings instead. But this early version of Paladin was drastically different, and I think it went through the most changes from this early alpha stage to launch. And that's it, just a few alpha abilities for every single one of the vanilla classes. There's definitely more to talk through here over the various pre-release stages of vanilla, and you can see a lot of the makings of how classes ended up being, or even in some cases previews of abilities which would become available many years later. Looking into unknown or removed items from vanilla is always something I found interesting to do, because there's simply so many cool and unique things that have been lost to time. And when you think you've heard of everything, there's always just something new to find. Today I have some of perhaps the most obscure and intriguing items I found whilst doing this type of video. And honestly, if you've heard everything on this list today, you must have actually worked on vanilla or something, because for a bunch of these I had no idea they existed until I came across them whilst I was looking through old information. So here's a few more items and facts which were removed from vanilla that you may or may not have known about. This has to be one of the weirdest potions I've seen in the game, called the Cowardly Flight Potion. Upon use, you run in fear at a high speed from a nearby enemy, and if there are no enemies nearby you, you instead stand frozen in fear. It even uses a feather in the recipe. I guess you'd have to be chicken to use this. But essentially it sounds as though when you use this potion, you cast fear on yourself. Normally with fear you gain a 25% movement speed buff when you're under this effect, if you didn't know that, and this counts for both players and NPCs. This is what typically makes fear an unpredictable crowd control effect, which can sometimes backfire really badly. However, the spell details for this potion said that it gave a 200% movement speed buff for a whole 30 seconds, which, as you can imagine, will probably mean you'll be able to escape from just about anything, assuming you randomly get feared in the right direction, that is, which, let's be honest, you won't. The catch is that if no enemies are around, you are instead frozen in place in a state of fear, so you'd get so far away from enemies and then potentially just stop in place and then be feared on the spot so they can catch up to you again. If you use this and it worked how you wanted, it would be effective, and it also says on the spell details that it was a physical effect, which means you can't dispel or remove it yourself. Once you use this, you're on the wild ride for the whole duration. Or alternatively, you could have just used the rather more boring swiftness potion for a 50% movement speed buff, which is often good enough to escape from something and not need to worry about the many downsides of the Cowardly Flight Potion. And I guess it was for this reason that this strange potion was eventually removed from the game, because it was just a bit too out there and its uses would have been hard to find. Next I have another potion, the Potion of Fervor. This was made by using a cracked skull mortar, which it's not clear how you got your hands on those, along with a fist-sized spinneret, which are in the game and are a trash quality item. But you can still see very old Wowhead comments about people asking how this is used for a potion. This potion increased strength by 14 and caused a small amount of damage to the player every 3 seconds. The tooltip does say it caused damage every 15 seconds, but the spell detail says it does 15 damage every 3 seconds, and they tend to be right. This doesn't seem like that much to be interested about, but taking a very small amount of damage very frequently would, in certain circumstances, be very valuable. For instance, on Assyrian the Unscarred in AQ20, he stuns the main tank for 10 seconds and then swaps to the next highest threat target, but if the main tank takes any damage, the stun will break, so this potion would have been great for that on solo tank strategies. And of course, I think it goes without saying, but this potion would have become a standard PvP tool used by all players. People already use things such as Skull of Impending Doom to break crowd control, but that thing can actually do a lot of damage and it takes up your offhand slot. This is just a tiny bit of damage every 3 seconds for a whole minute. Everyone would have a hard counter to mages being able to spam polymorph and reset a fight forever, or rogues with their whole spam of CC such as Sap, Gouge and Blind. The only weakness of this potion is that its effect would have been dispellable. Then again, some other effects such as the free action potion, restorative potion and so on are already magic dispellable and they're still used all of the time. One final potion for you here, the Elixir of Tongues. When consumed, this would allow you to understand the common speech of the opposite faction for 1 hour, or in other words, Horde and Alliance would be able to talk with one another. This was made through some pretty common items you'd find through herbalism and would have been really a complete game changer for how the whole faction dynamic between Horde and Alliance would work. Imagine how this would have affected faction collusion for events such as the opening of AQ, or popping a tongues real fast to offer some choice words to the gnome or undead rogue that's been ganking you for the past hour, because it's always one of those two, isn't it? The text on it, however, suggests that it was added at a very early stage before racial languages actually existed within the game, and the effect of this potion doesn't seem to do anything. And to be honest, I'm glad this didn't make it alive. The language barrier just feels like a natural part of what separates the two factions in the game. It would be weird being able to have a conversation with somebody and then you can't group with them or do a dungeon or anything. There were a few mounts planned for Vanilla 2 which didn't make it to live. One of them was the Naxxramas Death Charger's Reigns. As the name suggests, you'd have to assume this mount would drop from Nax, perhaps from the Four Horsemen. They seem as though a pretty likely candidate. Then again, they already dropped the highly sought after Corrupted Ashbringer. Did they really need two big items on their drop table? Appearance-wise, the Naxxramas Death Charger looks identical to Rivendar's Death Charger, which is perhaps one of the rarest items in all of vanilla, with a rumored drop rate of 1 in 5,000. And maybe this is why this mount wasn't pushed to live. Blizzard wanted the Rivendar mount to really stand out in the crowd, and it definitely does. Well, assuming you're Alliance anyway. Next up, did you know that the Black Kiraji Resonating Crystal wasn't the only legendary quality mount in vanilla? There was actually a second, which was named the Fabled Steed. In a time before flying mounts, this would have been something truly unimaginable, but it would allow you to summon a chromatic drake to ride around on. It appears as though it was put in the game files more for fun than being a serious consideration to be added into the game. Even the tooltip of the mount says "you wish" on it. Appearance-wise, it's identical to Warchief Ren Blackhand's mount Gith, which I'm sure you've seen plenty of in UBRS over the years, and interestingly, it also shows a model with Experiment 12B, which is a very rare drop from Ultraxion in Dragon Soul. Next up, we're heading to the Blasted Lands. You know those quests when they want you to farm loads of animal parts from animals who half the time do not have said parts on them? The ones that give consumes for raids such as roids and so on. Well, at one point Blizzard were considering adding a permanent version of these consumables into the game. However, instead during live you need to fork out a bunch of gold on the auction house for the materials and then head over to the Blasted Lands every week to pick them up. Imagine how much people would have paid for a permanent version of a really good consumable that also had no cooldown. A lot of gold, surely. But for whatever reason, Blizzard decided it would be better if you went back and needed to buy some more each time you wanted these consumables. And maybe with the emphasis on getting people out in the world in vanilla, this wasn't such a bad idea, despite the obvious loss in convenience. The same went for the Zanza consumables from the Zandalar tribe, which are earned at Revered. Blizzard were considering a permanent version of those as well, but as it is now in vanilla, you can have one consumed and another one in your bag as they are unique. A permanent Spirit of Zanza for the 50+ stamina and spirit buff would have been huge, and the Swiftness of Zanza is a 20% movement speed buff. Having that active all the time would be so good for PvP, mage boosting, and, well, just about everything really. As you'll know, there are different types of weapon trainers all over Azeroth who can train you to use a variety of different weapons. However, pre-release there were plans for each weapon to be only trained off of one specific trainer, and some of the locations of these trainers were, let's just say, a little bit inconvenient. If you want to train swords or polearms on the Alliance, well, the trainers used to be in Netherguard Keep. Great, let me just corpse run through the Swamp of Sorrows for 20 minutes. Sounds great, thank you, Blizzard. I mean, these days there will be some guy with a summoning service, you already know that, but imagine needing to do this for each weapon type. Also, the Horde had far fewer types of weapon skills available, notably missing crossbows, thrown weapons, and fist weapons, though I suspect this may have just been missing information, as both thrown weapons and fist weapons seem very fitting for the Horde. Also, you may have noticed on the Alliance list there is a two-handed spear trainer, and up until patch 1.1, so we're talking post-launch of the game here, two-hand spears existed as a weapon type, but they were all removed during this patch, and existing two-hand spears were changed into polearms instead. And you know what? Druids, hunters, and warriors could use two-handed spears. Druids, of course, cannot use polearms in vanilla, which is so easy to forget because you just assume they can because they've been able to do so for so long. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Druids are the only class to have lost a weapon type in vanilla, and possibly in World of Warcraft's history as well. Really, it seems to me that if they could use spears, that they should have been able to wield polearms as well, but it wouldn't be until Wrath of the Lich King when Blizzard finally added this weapon type back for the Druid. The story of the Ashbringer is a legendary one in World of Warcraft, but a story that's only ever showed small parts of itself within the game. At one point during the World of Warcraft beta, there was a quest named The Legacy of the Ashbringer, where some refreshing spring water and cheese were needed to complete the quest, with the quest reward being Ashbringer Test 002. I guess this quest had you give some food to an injured person, and then they handed over their version of the Ashbringer for you to do something with it, because they were unable to complete the mission themselves. This quest is also categorized as happening in Stratholme, and you may also know that the portal right at the end of Strat, just near where you fight Baron Rivendar, at one point used to be the entrance portal to Naxxramas, similar to how the entrance to Molten Core core is deep within Blackrock Depths and so on, but Blizzard would change this later and make achievements so you could get into the instances more easily. This shows to me that there are intentions in vanilla for the Ashbringer to be more than just corrupted in Naxxramas, but for whatever reason, maybe Blizzard weren't able to complete this questline in time, or maybe it just wasn't good enough for them. The Ashbringer story is quite mysterious in vanilla, with the last we hear of it being from High Inquisitor Fairbanks in Scarlet Monastery Cathedral during a special event with a player wielding the corrupted Ashbringer. He simply says that Darian Mogray may be capable of cleansing the blade, but he's gone off somewhere to Outland, and then Blizzard didn't follow through with this story in TBC either. So there's a lot of loose ends to be picked up here, and one day maybe the story of the Ashbringer will be completed in vanilla. During the alpha of World of Warcraft, First Aid had a recipe that would have been an absolute game changer, because you would have been able to resurrect people with First Aid. This item was called Formula Powerful Smelling Salts, and with 250 First Aid and 4 Deep Rock Salt, you could resurrect someone when out of combat. It would have made Deep Rock Salt quite commonly traded as well and have a good value. This would have been so useful in all areas of content, from 5 bans where you don't have a regular healer that can res, or just recovering a raid wipe. Then again, this means that everyone could res all the time, which does take away something from it being special and unique to the classes that can heal, and this is probably why it was removed from the game. Classic World of Warcraft is always so easy to get back into with its slow-paced leveling, gradual world building and character development. It can be quite relaxing to get on in the evening, do a few quests, watch the XP bar go up a bit, and maybe get a new piece of gear. It really is a great game to play on a casual basis as a very casual player. But casual isn't the speed for everyone in this game, and Classic was made a long time before things such as min-maxing, sharing information between players, and metagaming were all too common online. And over 20 years of this game's existence now has given us more than enough time to really dig deep into the fabric of this MMO and figure out what are, in theory, the best ways to do everything. And so on Classic's release in 2019, you better believe people unleashed all of this knowledge. This has, of course, led to many new discoveries, meta ways to do things, and of course, straight up degeneracy in its purest form. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Whilst this may be one of the easier and simpler MMOs to play out there by today's standards, it sure does not stop people from wanting to be as try-hard as possible when it comes to just about anything within the game. From controlling farming spots, having the fastest raid clears, or just, well, PvP in general, to be honest. As casual friendly as Classic WoW can be, it can also be a game where the limits of how degenerate you can get are really of your own making. These for me have to be the top 10 most degen moments of Classic WoW. Let's start with something that was pretty common during the leveling experience, and definitely towards the lower end of the degen scale, because I'm sure you've already seen people spamming for these types of groups again now on the anniversary realms, and that would be for the melee and spell cleave meta for leveling. So as I'm sure you know, Classic WoW leveling is very much a marathon instead of a sprint. Even the fastest players spend multiple in-game days in Azeroth to finally achieve level 60. In 2019, there were definitely leveling guides and add-ons which would have made things much easier than they would have been in 2004, but you'd still have to be thinking ahead, checking your map, and planning where to go next. Also, layering tech wasn't as good back then, so leveling bottlenecks were common, and as a result, what did people resort to but some good old dungeon farming? And there were really two main types of farming that went on. Spell cleaves were the most popular. This was a dungeon group consisting of multiple spellcasters, mages for the most part, and usually a priest healer. Power word fortitude and shields would usually keep your mages alive even if they got hit. Their farming will be similar enough to any open world farm here, just pull in tons of elites and gradually AoE them down. Also, very early on in Classic there was a bug where you could have more than 5 people in a dungeon and not suffer the raid group experience penalty, which you should have. So dungeon runs with 7 or more people were very popular. Melee cleaves were definitely a thing too, but melee AoE just can't compare with mages, and well, you have to be melee, which means you're going to get hit back. But if you go and spam Scarlet Monastery Armory to get yourself a Ravager, anyone can really join in the spin to win XP farming. Oh, and this was just way better on the Horde. Wind Fury with those extra attacks and chances to proc Ravager was really good. I think nowadays more people opt for the open world experience and taking your time, as rushing 60 just takes such a long time. But back then, a lot of people resorted to AoEing dungeons for days upon days. Next will be moving towards more endgame activities. In fact, every other point I have on here is about something towards the endgame, and we'll start off by talking about the world bosses of Classic WoW, especially the two that were added alongside Phase 2, those being Lord Kazakh in the Blasted Lands, as well as Azhagos in Ashara. So world bosses worked in one key different way compared to many future expansions, and that's that they had randomized spawn times which were several days long. They also had some extremely good loot for the time. Remember, up to Phase 2 you would have just had MC and Oni gear back then, and some of these items from world bosses will last you up to AQ40, which will be months later. This made these two bosses a serious target for all the top guilds on your realm, and you better believe that people went to any length to lock them down and to secure that loot. The issue then was, well, that they are world bosses, with the key word being world. They spawned in the open world, with one of them across all of the layers. At least they worked like that back then. And on PvP servers, not only did you have to get to the boss first, you'd also have to potentially hold off enemy faction guilds who also wanted to try and secure the loot for themselves. Or alternatively, maybe sometimes the boss just felt like spawning at 3 AM, so you'd have to get up in the middle of the night to slay a dragon real quick before getting back to bed again. And yes, people absolutely did do this. I mean, what matters more, your sleep schedule or maybe getting an epic in World of Warcraft? Exactly, you need the gear upgrades. Later on in Classic, the Green Dragon world bosses were also added, increasing the number of open world bosses to farm, but over time they became less contested due to better gear becoming available from instance raids. Defeating world bosses was one thing of course, but ultimately the average player never really saw much of them, which is why they put them all in instances during Season of Discovery. But something that everyone, especially on PvP servers, had to deal with was actually getting to raid in the first place. In every other version of WoW that isn't vanilla, getting to raid is not a problem. You just go to the raid, that's it. Not the case in vanilla. Why? World buffs. You know, the Chronoboom Displacer to store world buffs wasn't put in the game until about 2 months or so before the TBC pre-patch, by which time all the vanilla content had been out for ages. And if you had diligently collected all your world buffs ready to raid, the last thing you were ever going to do was risk losing them by going to the raid solo. Getting to the raid in the first place was a guild-wide effort, and each raid entrance had different bits of tech that people would use to get inside safely. The raids inside of Black Rock Mountain were the hardest to get into, since safe summoning spaces were few and far between inside of there, and there were only 2 entrances to the mountain, so if you were going there at peak time, which if you're raiding, you probably are, there were also going to be a lot of enemy faction guilds doing the same. So you'd group with other guilds which you saw heading in to bolster your numbers, you'd send scouts in there in advance to check for people, and maybe even use layering to your advantage. For me early on when I was on Gehennas, there was somebody that would multi-box dozens of shaman, back when that was allowed of course, and he would wait for a guild to go by, resurrect all his shaman, and then global about half their raid team. You had to scout him out and make sure he had just wiped before it was safe to go. For AQ40 and Naxxramas, there were also safe-ish summoning spots behind walls or near the entrance, and so much more. I did a full video on this a while ago if you want to hear about all the things people did. And oftentimes getting to the raid and the PvP that would happen was more fun and a lot more memorable than the raid itself, a classic case of vanilla emergent gameplay. Eventually I did transfer off to a PvE server though just before Naxxramas, as having to do gymnastics for every single raid with world buffs did eventually get kind of annoying. Still, getting into the raid and the coordination it needed was a big part of Classic in 2019, and Classic raiding itself ended up being a whole lot easier than what people from back in the day would have you believe. So what did people do but end up setting themselves new goals when it came to raiding, such as passing or speedrunning. And if you wanted to do well in raids, you needed to give yourself every advantage possible. One of those ways you could get ahead was simply via some good old open world farming. And in Phase 1, every physical damage dealer's prebis contained the iconic Devil Soul Leather 2 set. These items were super well itemized, both for the stats they gave, which directly increase your damage, and of course you got ever near to the all-important hit cap. Devil Soul gear of course would need Devil Soul leather, and and down in Ungoro the wars would rage between different groups of players looking to skin these dinosaurs for this all-important resource. Often referred to as the Devil Saw Mafia, controlling the spawn locations and the ability to skin would mean you control how much Devil Saw leather is being brought in on your server, and this got really competitive early on. People would spend entire days in Ungoro ensuring that no competitors would be able to get tags on the Devil Saw which spawned there, and even if somebody else managed to kill one, as long as it was looted, anyone was able to skin it, meaning on PvP servers you could CC someone that had just killed one and then skin it for yourself. Rogues lurking in the shadows were very much a threat for somebody looking to solo farm Devil Saw, so these Mafia players would have to roam Ungoro in groups to ensure their tags didn't get stolen. It was definitely degen, but ultimately this didn't really last for too long in the first place, as Blizzard increased the spawn rate of Devil Saw in Ungoro pretty fast, and people just began to outgear the need for Devil Saw as well, so locking them down wasn't as much of a priority. Speaking of farming, there was one area of the game where people got even more degenerate, and for way longer as well, and this is for Black Lotus. One Black Lotus is needed for each of the flasks in Classic WoW, and flasks back in Classic were just crazy with how much stats they gave. For example, a flask of Supreme Power in Classic would give 150 spell power. Just to compare, a flask of the Frostworm in Wrath of the Lich King gave 125 spell power. They did nerf Classic flasks in TBC in case you're wondering, that's why we still weren't using them. They also lasted 2 hours and persisted through death. But with all those stats to gain, you better believe that every single player raiding wanted to pop a flask to get the most out of their character, which means Black Lotus are going to be in incredibly high demand, and they definitely were. On every single server, each of the 4 zones where they could spawn, those being the Eastern Plaguelands, Burning Steppes, Winter Spring and Silithus, were camped night and day by people looking for this item. At first it was just the players who were leveled super fast who were able to get hold of them, but over time bots really began to take over and lock down the spawns. They would even have level 1 characters die on top of the various Black Lotus spawn locations just so they could track them in real time. And to be honest, I think people were also hoarding Black Lotus in pretty huge amounts, as prices for flasks ballooned way higher than they ever should have. We're talking 150 to 200g for a single flask for each week of raiding. That's on top of all your other consumables, by the way. This is Classic WoW, pretty much everything stacks. Imagine spending almost twice the cost for your level 40 mount and its training on a consumable which lasts 2 hours. Even seeing a Black Lotus in the open world was considered lucky, and as a regular player you really had to sit down and prepare for a session which would last a few hours of roaming a zone just to maybe get 1 or 2 of them. Towards a later patch, Blizzard finally decided to increase the volume of Black Lotus spawns in the world and make them spawn a lot more often, at which point prices for this herb and consequently flasks dropped down very fast. Nevertheless, they remained a highly sought after item, and for a good period of time in Classic WoW, both botters and herbers played a minigame to find this herb, and a lot of this preparation work was done for people's ultimate objective, the raiding content. We all heard from people back in the day that Classic raids were supposed to be hard, and that well under 1% of the player base ever cleared Nax, and those claims were found out to be a little different than remembered, let's just say that much. All the same, for some people, speedrunning became the ultimate objective of Classic, seeing as though how progression felt as though it was a given for everyone, and realistically all the top guilds had a few runs every 2 weeks to try and push their clear times and set new records. The big reasoning for this was the Darkmoon fur buff that was added towards the mid stage of Classic, as a new NPC Sage could give you a 10% damage buff, which would of course be absolutely key in pushing new boundaries. The guilds aiming for the fastest clears would also be stacking classes heavily, and no class featured so prominently throughout Classic as the Warrior, both as head and shoulders above any other class as the best DPS and the best tank. Apparently the hybrid tax doesn't apply if you can tank, or something. It wasn't irregular to see a good 24 warriors or more as part of these raiding squads either. In fact, people were stacking so many buffs that the buff cap of 32 genuinely would start to become a concern, and whilst tanks and DPS were blasting through the content, the healers had to make sure they were keeping up, and this is where there was actually quite a big divide between Horde and Alliance. With tons of gear, Holy Paladins basically didn't go oom anymore, as any heal that crit refunded 100% of the mana cost thanks to the Illumination talents, whereas with Horde and the Shaman, despite having the power of Wind Fury, could run through their mana fast. And every single melee group wanted Wind Fury, of course, so you're looking at a good 6 or so Resto Shamans per raid. And if it's a speedrun, you're not exactly stopping to drink either. So what Resto Shamans and priests on both factions, to be honest, would do is chug Flask of Distilled Wisdom as though it was a mana potion. These flasks increase your maximum mana by 2000 when used, but if you use them at 0 mana, they would grant you that much mana instead. And also flasks had no cooldown, and you remember how much they cost when we were talking about them. This got expensive very fast. To speedrun though, you really had to be pretty degenerate, that's just the name of the game. And a lot of the preparation that went into min-maxing raids seemed extreme, but none more so than for gathering all the various world buffs. It really just has to have a mention here. Some world buffs were actually pretty safe and easy to get, such as Rallying Cry of the Dragon Slayer on Horde or Alliance, Spirit of Zandalar, and Warchief's Blessing on Horde. Others though posed problems, particularly on PvP servers. For getting Diamol tribute buffs, you would typically get summoned inside of the Diamol North instance portal, before heading inside to talk to the NPC at the end, and then doubling back to gather all your buffs. Generally this wasn't too risky, though sometimes a rogue would get feared inside the unloaded instance portal to try and gank you. Songflower's Serenade from Felwood could be more of a problem since it was well out in the open world, and also each Songflower could only be activated once per 20 minutes. But if loads of people were there and clicking it at the same time, everyone could get the buff. A safety in numbers kind of thing. Unfortunately, at the same time, both the Diamol tribute buffs and the Songflower buff were magical effects, which means that they could be dispelled, and people would legitimately level characters to the point where they unlock their dispel, such as dispel magic on priest, purge on shaman, and then purposefully tried to remove people's buffs just to annoy them so they had to go and get them again. Some people would have these dispellers die inside of enemy faction capitals, wait around for somebody with buffs to appear, then resurrect and try and dispel them. On some servers this even got so bad that guilds offered bounties for dispelling or taking down enemy players with world buffs. It really did get that degenerate. Then again, there's the infamous gathering of Warchief's Blessing for Alliance, where you had to get mind controlled and temporarily swapped to the other faction to gather it, or even the Darkmoon Fur buff. The Darkmoon Fur only appears every few weeks and rotates between Elwyn Forest and Mulgore in Classic, which means even on PvP servers, the faction which is home to the Fur will not be automatically flagged, as their territory is not contested. So you could just stand there next to the NPC and wait for an opposite faction player to appear, and basically be able to non-verbally tell them you're not going to be able to get this. People would counter this by waiting nearby the Fur out of sight whilst another player queues them for a battleground. Once the battleground queue pops, you use an invisibility potion or a cloaking device or something, and then run up to the NPC that gives the buff. Pop a flask of petrification so no one can harm you, get the buff, accept the battleground queue, leave the battleground, and you'll be teleported back to where your party leader took the battleground queue from, so Stormwind or Orgrimmar. And there you go, buff acquired safely. Until people started camping outside with the PvP NPCs wearing capitals, as people with the Darkmoon Fur buff would still be flagged from being in enemy territory. And yes, people really did do this on rogues. So we're starting to get to a pretty high level of degeneracy now, and with 3 to go, the last ones are going to take stuff to a whole other level. When Phase 5 and the Gates of Anchorage was set to go live, we were due to relive a very special moment in World of Warcraft, an event which would create unique stories on each individual server across every region in the world, full of their own heroes, villains, and stories to remember. This event encapsulated the willingness for Blizzard back in the day to try things out which by today's standards seem crazy, alongside the community's newfound tendency to really min-max. And the results were legendary. Where back in the day it took weeks for the first war effort supply to be completed, in Classic it was done in a mere 14 hours. You needed to have prepared literally millions of items for this, by the way. Originally you'd have seen maybe a handful of Scarab Lords on each server, but in Classic, Fairbanks US saw 49 of them in total, and Russian server Flamegore had over 90 owners of the mount before the event was over. You couldn't even imagine 1/10 of these numbers with how realms used to be. But one of the biggest bottlenecks for individual players was actually assembling the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. This was one of the first quests in this legendary series, and it needed you to gather some 42,000 Silphid Carapace fragments in order to advance your standing with the Brood of Nozdormu reputation so you could continue the quest, which meant killing killing a whole lot of bugs down in Silithus. Entire guilds would lock down hives where these Silithid would spawn, and Horde and Alliance would cooperate with one another to ensure that only those who had entered into an agreement would be allowed to farm freely. Collusion and drama were rampant. Really, as a more casual player, all you could do was be a soldier in the war for somebody designated to get a scepter, or just watch the drama unfold, not only on your server, but hearing of all the different happenings on servers worldwide. Everyone who took part in this event will have a story to tell which is unique to how they experienced this event. It was certainly crazy for Blizzard to try back in the day, and there's really never been anything like it since, but it certainly made moments to remember. At number 2, we have another grind. Whilst getting the scepter and farming bugs took a lot of effort, don't get me wrong, you weren't going to be doing it for months and months. The same cannot be said for our next one, which is the grind to rank 14. So I've done a full video on exactly how the PvP system worked in vanilla and all the various tips and tricks people use to abuse the system. And when you look back at it, it's crazy how many people really went out of their way to do this. In short though, rank 14 is the highest PvP rank available in Classic WoW, which will enable you to buy the best possible items. And these items, by the way, are great for both PvP and PvE. Each week you would earn honor via honorable kills and completing PvP objectives. And at the end of the week, your honor earned is compared to the rest of the participants on your realm who had taken part in PvP during that week. And then people will be sorted out into percentages in terms of honor earned. So there will be a top 1% of earners, top 2%, and so on. And then ranking points are assigned to you based upon where you landed percentage-wise in honor earned for the last week. And your ranking points increased your rank. So overall, earn lots of honor, be among the top percentage-wise, get ranking points, advance rank. That's the very simple version. However, you'll lose 20% of your ranking points each week via decay, and you could drop down ranks like this. So once you started PvPing and advancing your rank, you could not stop or miss a week, or you would potentially be losing weeks of progression. In fact, from rank 13 to 14, you had to have been one of the top earner on your realms for that week, or your decay would surpass your ranking points earned. People will be locked in for 14-hour days of PvP grinding for week after week after week on end. It was truly a brutal grind, and it's not too hard to see why the PvP system has changed since then, to be honest. All in all, you had to be a sweaty player to reach rank 14 on the old system, or even anything past 11, to be honest. It was simply not content you would ever see casually, and that's why for me it has to be so high on this list. But there is one moment which surpasses that. You see, rank 14 is probably one of the toughest grinds you can take on as an individual player, but you have to opt in, nobody's forcing you to do it. But there was a moment in Classic which forever changed the majority of realms. Well, assuming you were on a PvP realm, that is, and that was the start of Phase 2 in WoW Classic. When Phase 2 released back then, we were still very much #no changes, which means we wanted things as they were back then, and we sure got that. As when the honor system was first implemented back on April 19th, 2005, it was done so without any battlegrounds in the game, which meant for our way more min-maxy player base on WoW Classic, their only option for farming honor to advance their rank was through World PvP. Now suddenly any player who was level 48 plus would grant honor to a level 60, because two-shotting somebody who's a dozen levels below you is very honorable. So if you were still leveling at this point in time, you would legitimately become hunted non-stop by max level highly geared groups of organized players who would be on all day, every day. Every single endgame leveling zone instantly became unplayable as people sought to gain honor. Remember, you have to be in the top percentage of honor earned to get the most ranking points to advance your rank. So the limit on how much honor you need is, well, there isn't one. So farming level 52 players over in Western Plaguelands was what you should have been doing. We even saw the return of South Shore versus Terran Mill. If you were a faction minority on your server, you really felt it as well. You were like a walking bag of honor points that people had their eyes on non-stop. In fact, a trip from the Searing Gorge flight path to Blackrock Depths could take you a good 20 to 30 minutes, where each time you would res, gain a few more meters, and then be sent back to the graveyard. Things got so bad and some people were so desperate to farm honor that ganking in capital cities started to happen. Rogues would be lurking in areas without guards nearby, and mages would go a Pom Pyro spec, resurrect, one-shot somebody, run back, and repeat for hours, all day, every day. It was absolute peak degen for classic WoW, and nothing will ever top this. Blizzard had to bring out Battlegrounds way earlier than planned to stop the world PvP farming, as several servers saw their population collapse under the non-stop farming that was taking place. And once Battlegrounds were out, things got more normal again as they became the best way to farm honor. And that's why those for me have to be 10 of the most degen moments of classic WoW. With the biggest landmass of any version of World of Warcraft, Classic is not short on quests. From the humble beginnings of delivering letters and collecting items, all the way to solving multi-zone mysteries and obtaining legendary items. Questing is without a doubt a huge part of this game, and Blizzard already had so many years of games they had made to draw inspiration from, but getting everything into World of Warcraft when it came to the MMO would prove a little bit more challenging. Whilst many huge quest chains do begin in Classic, a lot of them don't end, or at least they don't end in a conclusive and satisfying way. In some cases it would be many years or expansions later until certain stories were picked back up and finally finished. And that's really what I want to talk about today, the massive world-spanning quests which start but don't really end in Classic. I want to cover their stories, what happens during Vanilla, where the game leaves off at, how they end up being used later on, and perhaps how these quests could have finished in a vanilla setting one day. So with that said, let's make a start. When you hear of the Scythe of Elune, you probably think of the Boomkin artifact weapon from Legion. That's been its most famous use within the game. But its story goes back very far, and it has a whole quest line in vanilla. In fact, unless you really go out of your way to complete this quest, you may have never heard about this being in the game, because believe me, this quest has an insane amount of traveling, and I've no real idea how you fit it into any efficient questing route. Oh, also it is Alliance only, so yeah, not everyone's gonna see it by default. It starts over in Ashenvale with the quest to the Howling Vale. This has you investigate an area in Ashenvale to assess the Worgen threat within the zone. Whilst there you'll learn of a night elf named Valinda Starsong. And here's where we need a bit of backstory. So Valinda was originally sent to Ashenvale to cleanse it of the demon threats that was starting to overtake this important strategic zone. Upon arriving, however, things were worse than predicted, and the forces of the Night Elves by themselves were not enough to hold the demons off. Valinda prayed to Elune for an answer, where eventually through learning of a book in Darnassus, she was led to the Shrine of Melthandris, where she discovered the Scythe of Elune which had been hidden away. Channeling the Scythe's power, she learned of the Worgen and was able to bring them into Azeroth to combat the demon threat. After having defeated them, however, the Scythe kept summoning more and more Worgen into the world, despite Valinda not wishing for it to do so. However, she had heard of a human mage to the east who had also summoned the Worgen to this world. His name was Archmage Aragorn, so she set off in search of this mage, hoping that he could offer help. And it's kind of here where the quest picks back up in the game. You head over to Darnassus and find Valinda's journal, which says at the end, "On the morrow I will travel to the port in the Barrens and book passage to the new world." So you follow her trail back down from Darnassus all the way to Ratchet and over into Booty Bay, where from a goblin you learn she was headed north into Duskwood, and to ask more about it there. More travelling later, you arrive at Duskwood and are sent to investigate Roland's Doom. This is where the Worgen first appeared as if out of nowhere in this zone, and perhaps the Scythe could have been related to this incident. At Roland's Doom you only find a mound of dirt and a vision of Valinda which is conjured forth, lamenting the loss of the Scythe to unknown forces. After this you return to Darkshire to deliver the news before heading back to Darnassus to report on everything which has happened, with the final words of the quest being, "Another matter for another time, however. I owe you my thanks in no small amount for what you have accomplished." I know Night Elves used to have immortality and everything, but this is some next level procrastination. You've learned of an immensely powerful weapon that can summon the Worgen into the world, and you think, yeah, but we'll deal with it later on, I guess. What really happened though gives us a bit more information, some of which you will be able to find in game and some of it you won't. So Valinda was indeed travelling to meet Archmage Aragorn, however she was attacked in Duskwood by Varkus, a Worgen who had travelled from Shadowfang Keep to take the Scythe for himself. During their battle they were led inside of Roland's Doom where a crate of dynamite exploded, killing everyone involved and burying the Scythe in the rubble. And who should stumble upon the Scythe and cause the Worgen to be summoned in Duskwood but the seemingly harmless Jitters. Yep, that totally not suspicious guy hanging out at Raven Hill. His completed journal tells the bigger story here, saying, "But ever since I found the haft of the scythe jutting from that pile of rubble in the mine and, curse me, pulled it free, Roland's Doom has become a place of vile death." The journal goes on to tell you the story of the Dark Riders of Deadwind Pass and their search for the scythe within Duskwood, the same Dark Riders from Season of Discovery, and the ones you faced in Legion if you did the Boomy quest too. And that's kind of as far as we get here. In World of Warcraft the MMO, the scythe is lost and the Dark Riders still search for it. What happens next is in the Curse of the Worgen book series. Here a party are sent from Stormwind to recover artifacts stolen by the Dark Riders and are told by Jitters the location of the scythe, and they are successful in recovering it. After using the scythe to bait the Dark Riders into an ambush, it is then passed on to a Night Elf of Valorn Stillbow, who finally delivers it to Gilneas. So really, if the scythe was not present at Roland's Doom, and Jitters' journal doesn't make any mention of the party he encountered, we're kind of a bit in between those two things happening in the game. Really by now the scythe should be in the hands of the good guys, and Jitters should make some mention of directing them to it if this were the case. But that's as far as we get, and this quest definitely needs a proper ending in a classic sense. Could the staff be tied in with the opening of Gilneas? Maybe it should be a new legendary weapon wielded by druids to grant them the savage power of the Worgen in some way. Indeed, maybe there are other possibilities which would be worth doing too. But that was our first story, and now we're moving on to our second. And this one is going to be one that people are a bit more familiar with. It's the story of the missing diplomat, though where this truly ends spans a lot more content than just vanilla, that's for sure. It starts off as a simple quest to speak to a bishop regarding the disappearance of a diplomat who is sent to Theramore to meet with Jaina Proudmoore. However, the bishop suspects that the Defias Brotherhood became involved somehow with their disappearance and wants you to investigate. Above all, this news has not become widespread public knowledge yet, so discretion and speed are of the essence. The quest from here on out, as I'm sure you'll know if you've ever done it, has you do a whole lot of running around the world and talking to different people. It's definitely worth reading those quests through one time when you're running between different places though. You go from Stormwind to Duskwood, back to Stormwind, over to the wetlands, and it's in the wetlands where we really find the nature of this missing diplomat. Upon apprehending Tadpoke Slim Jan, he has this to say: "The Defias didn't pay me well enough to die for their cause. They took the king." Yeah, the king of Stormwind, not some lowly diplomat. He was on his way to Theramore to meet with Jaina Proudmoore, and it was a big deal apparently, and a big secret. But it's not just the Defias that are involved, they're working with someone. I think they knew this was bigger than them. My part was just to get their man on board the king's ship whilst it was in the harbour. The guy's name was Hendel, that's all I know, I swear. So over to Dustwallow you head and manage to take on Hendel, and just as you do, Jaina Proudmoore and her associates teleport in, seemingly well aware of what's been going on before taking Hendel away for further questioning, with the final words of the quest series being from Jaina herself, who says, "When you visit Theramore in the future, seek me out and I shall try to keep you appraised of the situation. Thank you again." So in the game we know the king himself has been captured whilst on a diplomatic trip, but that's about as far as we get. In reality, up to patch 1.9 in World of Warcraft, King Varian Wrynn was actually an NPC in the game, and was being held at Alkaz Island just to the north of Theramore, and as suspected it was the Defias that took him hostage, but something much bigger was at work in the background. Though for whatever reason during vanilla, Blizzard didn't get around to finishing this story, and believe me, there's still a lot of story to get through. After patch 1.9, Varian was removed from the game and replaced by a named NPC who never really served any purpose within the game. However, in patch 2.3 during the Burning Crusade, you may well remember that Dustswallow Marsh got quite the update. It now featured Mudsprocket as a new questing hub, as well as over 50 new quests in total, and it was here that Blizzard picked back up the story of King Varian Wrynn and the missing diplomat. A new quest called A Disturbing Development has reports of Defias patrolling north of Theramore and sends you to check things out. During this time you find that the Defias were transporting a precious cargo, who was in fact a prisoner, and you report this back to Jaina Proudmoore. You then conduct a survey of Alkaz Island by air and strangely find the presence of black dragons there. Jaina sends you to report back on this to High Lord Bolvar Foredragon in Stormwind, and when you arrive you let him know the Defias have a powerful ally in Stormwind who is directly involved with the disappearance of the king. To which Bolvar basically says okay, despite Lady Katrana Prestor protesting against these claims. Lady Prestor is, of course, as we know it, Onyxia. I mean, spoilers, I guess, but come on, who doesn't know this? And technically, she would have still been alive by this point in the game, meaning in the MMO at least, we wouldn't have known about her dying until some way through TBC. Anyways, you go back to Jaina and inform her of the situation and that you've made Bolvar aware, and she says, "Cheers for that, bro, I appreciate it." And the quest just randomly ends again. So in vanilla, we find out the king's missing and a man is taken for questioning, and then nothing happens. In TBC, we know the Defias has a powerful ally in Stormwind. We know again that it's been the king who's been kidnapped, and that more than likely Alkaz Island was involved, and then nothing just happens afterwards. And then at the start of Wrath of the Lich King, Varian just reappears, and we kind of take it from there. So what actually happened to Varian between his kidnapping? How did he come back? Well, I'm gonna be honest, this is a lot of story. If you want the full thing, because I'm just gonna give you the short version of it with the main points, I'd definitely check out a video by Nobble on this subject. He's covered pretty much everything World of Warcraft lore-wise, so he's definitely your guy for the longer version. I should also mention some of what happens with Varian's story does go on in the game, and given that, I can kind of understand why they didn't want to fully go through with his story when the player had really already experienced some of it. So Varian was indeed captured by the Defias whilst on his way to Theramore for a diplomatic meeting. During his capture, Onyxia comes along and does some spell which splits Varian into two different beings. There's the weaker Varian and the stronger one. The stronger one escapes, washes up on the shores of Jorotar, and is captured by the orcs and made into a gladiator. Varian, being an absolute chad, wins pretty much everything and is given a name by the orcs, Logosh, meaning ghost wolf. He later escapes from them and reunites with Jaina, who reveals his true nature through the use of magic, that he is the king of Stormwind. At this point, Logosh, not Varian, Varian's the weak one who got left behind on Alkaz Island, rallies his allies to go and confront Onyxia. He also frees Marshal Windsor from prison. This is the bit that the player does in-game during the Onyxia attunement. And then you know the section afterwards where you do the escort through Stormwind? That should also be Varian who's leading that, not the player. So again, Blizzard kind of swapped the roles out here to put the player at the front of the action. They march to Stormwind Keep and Varian reveals Lady Prestor's true identity as Onyxia. And similar to in-game, she turns into her dragon form, all the guards turn into dragon spawn, and there's a big battle. And it's after this battle where the books and the game start to differ once again. In the game, we're given the fragments of the Drakefire amulet to go and repair so we can take on Onyxia inside her lair. In the books, however, Onyxia kidnaps Anduin and retreats to her lair. It's there that Varian and Logosh and his allies confront Onyxia again. Here she tries to use that same magic blast that eventually split Varian in two to kill him once and for all, but the weaker Varian jumps in front of the blast to save Logosh, who he believes is the true Varian. But Logosh isn't happy with that, and he tries to come to his doppelganger's aid, and both men are reforged, I guess, into one man after being hit by this blast. After this, Varian kills off Onyxia and hangs her head outside of Stormwind and returns as the king. So really, you shouldn't see Onyxia's head hanging outside Stormwind at all until he has returned as the king. So given this, I think you can see how there's quite a few differences between different versions of World of Warcraft and how the story is told. And they had used a chunk of Varian's story for the Onyxia attunement in vanilla. In fact, Onyxia alongside Molten Core were the two raids that launched with vanilla at the very start. And Varian wouldn't return to Stormwind to be the king until sometimes later, so really from the very beginning it didn't ever feel as though they gave themselves the chance to finish his story all the way through. Then again, in the game he just kind of randomly reappears and we don't hear too much about that. So perhaps one day in a vanilla setting there's a way where we could free the king or have him come back to Stormwind in a bit of a reimagined way given all the story that he has. Even the Horde could probably get involved with one side of it because he does spend a bunch of time with the Horde. But we have had plenty of Alliance stories so far, I realise that, so let's do a Horde one to switch things up, shall we? For number 3, we're going to be talking about the quest chain known as Nothing But the Truth. Whilst this does have an ending in Classic, it definitely leaves open a lot of questions about the motives of the Forsaken as members of the Horde. It starts off in Duskwood of all places. There's a ruined tower known as Beggar's Haunt where two Forsaken are camped out. Upon talking to them, they mention that a human infiltrator had found their camp. However, he was captured by orcs and brought to Stonar before they had the chance to do anything about it, and they want to help their allies by making a truth serum so that this man will talk. The next part of the quest is truly one of the most classic WoW quests you will ever do. You need to collect 3 items: Mirelord Fungus, which isn't too hard to get from the Swamp of Sorrows, Shadow Panther Hearts, these are from a rarish mob with a really bad drop rate, and the third item needs you to go over to Desolus of all places and get a drop from one of the Deep Strider giants that patrol the zone, and these guys are super rare. For quests like this, assuming I have a hunter leveled, I always just go to the zone with them and spam Eagle Eye until I can find one. So you gather those items up over probably a few hours, and for our next part, the apothecary mixes them up into a truth serum and hides it in a drink. We take this over to the Swamp of Sorrows and talk to the human at Stoneyard, who very interestingly has to say, "Please have mercy on me, I have information that goes beyond Alliance boundaries. Whilst I am no sympathizer of the Horde, there is political treachery going on that must be revealed." Nevertheless, he takes the drink and begins to talk, saying, "I believe the Forsaken are misleading allies of the Horde," before suddenly collapsing and turning into a zombie. Unfortunately, the nearby Orc guards aren't all too concerned with him randomly dying. It seems as though the Forsaken camp was operating outside of the knowledge of the Horde, and instead as part of the Royal Apothecary Society to create, well, some kind of poison or plague. At least that's what they're usually up to. And the human found out something that he was not supposed to, so he had to be dealt with. As we know, some years later in Wrath of the Lich King, there was the whole Wrathgate incident where the Royal Apothecary Society showed their hand by poisoning Horde and Alliance alike. So this could have been one of the very early hints in the game of their true intentions. All the same, the Forsaken's actions stopped any information getting out to the rest of the Horde about their activity, and leave what the human had to say as a questline that both feels as though it had an end, but could have had way more to it at the same time. Another bit of content that was started in Classic but never really went anywhere was regarding the Draenei Exiles. Located in northwestern Swamp of Sorrows, there is a camp of friendly Draenei which you've probably run across, except they don't look like any Draenei you'll find in future expansions, that's for sure. In fact, in TBC, these guys had their names changed to Broken to more closely match what other Broken look like. But the Draenei that exists during this time would have already had to have been here for a long while. They would have had to have crossed the Dark Portal when it was opened up to Draenor. The leader of this camp is named Magtor and is involved in 2 quests, one to collect some crystals and the other to hand in an item to prove the death of an enemy. The place you get the crystals from to the east has a lot of less than friendly Draenei. These ones have been driven mad by the passage of time and their inability to find their way home, and are now simply known as the Lost Ones. Even though by this time in WoW's story, Outland would not have been a particularly nice place to go back to. There is also, strangely enough, one quest you get if you side with the Gelkis Centaur all the way over in Desolus. Here they also want one of the Draenei crystals as proof of allegiance to their cause. Finally, there is Comitia the Collector over in the Blasted Lands, who really didn't go all that far after crossing the Dark Portal. He is always searching for some rare Draenethist crystals, with the hope that he can use one to open a portal back to his home world. In exchange for this, he gives you random stuff he calls junk, even though if you hand in the rare crystal, you can get some pretty good items from him, to be honest. And that's kind of as far as the Draenei story goes. They cross the portal, and they want to find a way back, and are trying to hold on to their sanity during their long stay here. It does feel as though the start of something else could have been there though. Maybe quests to help them find their way back, involve them with some more professions from their alien lands perhaps, or of course over the years people have even speculated at their potential for a new race within the game. Either way, we do technically have Draenei in Classic, they are just quite a bit different to what you'd usually see them as. Last but not least is a quest series that takes place in Dustswallow Marsh, where both the Horde and the Alliance try to solve the mystery of the Shady Rest Inn. You'll have no doubt been past this location and picked these quests up more than once. It's the inn that's been destroyed just between where you cross over from Dustwallow into the Barrens. Here you find 3 clues, a black shield, a Theramore guard badge, and some suspicious hoof prints. For both factions, the black shield leads you to taking it to a blacksmith, and in both cases they link it to being large enough for a Tauren, but that's really as far as they get. On the Horde side, they speculate the hoof prints maybe could have been from a Quillboar or a Centaur, but both factions send a tracker to investigate more and see what extra information they can get. Where things get very different though is the final part of the quest, which starts from the Theramore Guard's badge, which belonged to Lieutenant Reith. For the Alliance, a party is dispatched to find Wreath, and on the Horde your character and an ogre go to question him about the Shady Rest Inn. During this final Horde quest, the Alliance party led by Lieutenant Caldwell attack and kill Wreath, whilst the Horde player retaliates by killing the entire Alliance party, leaving no one standing who really would have the knowledge to continue the quest, and ultimately after this it has a rather abrupt dead end. During TBC in patch 2.3 when Dustswallow was updated, however, this quest was given an ending. After having completed the 3 prior quests, both on Horde or Alliance, a new one will open up which links the Grim Toten Tauren more directly to the destruction of the Shady Rest Inn. After some more investigating to confirm that this is true, the player finally leads an attack on the Grim Totem in Dustswallow and destroys their camp, which shortly after ends the mystery of the Shady Rest Inn for both factions. In a vanilla setting, the Grim Totem destroying the inn could very well be a possibility. There are of course Grim Totem down in Thousand Needles which could have been linked to it. The problem is they're way off the level bracket for what the player would be at if they were questing in Dustswallow. Also, there are no Grim Totem in Dustswallow in vanilla either. The whole camp that was added in TBC doesn't exist, so we can't use that either. So it remains a quest which one day perhaps could use an end. You could tie it perhaps to some of the Grim Toten Tauren in Feralus, even though that would be content which is at a much higher level than Dustswallow, but vanilla sends you to other zones through breadcrumb quests all the time, so maybe that makes enough sense here. Imagine there is a certain item in World of Warcraft that quite literally everyone wants, but only players with a certain profession are able to gather, and even then it's impossibly rare. An item which is used in consumables that are disproportionately powerful and required if you really want to push performance in raiding. Well, back in Classic WoW there was such an item, and it was called the Black Lotus. Black Lotus were part of a number of important profession items too, such as the Gorobashi Mojo Madness. You needed this to spawn the extra boss in Zul'Gurub for the class trinkets, or the stealth enchant on cloaks, so rogues could be that little extra bit annoying, but their main use were for flasks. Now in, to be honest, every expansion since Classic, flasks have not been too much of a problem. They're not going to cost you the majority of your gold to get 1 or 2 of them, and there's a number of reasons why this happened. Top of the list is that the ingredients became significantly easier to obtain. You needed a lot less of them, as well as profession specializations allowing for extra crafts. None of this was the case in vanilla. Flasking in vanilla was a commitment, and it kind of had to be because these flasks were A, really hard to make, and B, really overpowered. Take Flask of Supreme Power for an example, as it was in vanilla, a 2-hour buff that gives 150 spell power. Now in TBC, Blizzard realized, these vanilla flasks are kind of really good, so they nerfed Supreme Power down from 150 spell power to 70. Then the new flasks in TBC, such as Flask of Pure Death, gave 80 spell power, and then Wrath came around where Flask of the Frostworm gives 125 spell power. So if we're comparing the unchanged version of each flask between each expansion, the vanilla flask that we were using at level 60 is 25 spell damage more powerful than the one that we're currently using at level 80. And in starter raid gear, a flask could legitimately contribute to about 30% or more of your total spell damage. And of course they lasted through death as well, no other consumable did this. It's a pretty similar story for all the other flasks, for all the other roles as well in vanilla. So yeah, what I'm saying is these things are pretty overpowered. On top of that, you had to go to a special crafting table too in order to actually make them. It wasn't like it was in TBC where you had an alchemy table in Shattrath that was easy to get to, or Wrath where you can just make them anywhere. In Phase 1 of Classic, the only place in the game you could make flasks was Scholomance, not something a solo player could just hop in and do either. In Phase 2 there was an alchemy table added to Blackwing Lair just after Broodlord Lashalayer. It was even placed you could go and craft flasks whilst waiting for the flame buffet stacks to drop on the Firemaw encounter. Pretty convenient that you could do that. But the biggest hurdle was assembling the items. Flasks simply needed a huge amount of ingredients per one, each one requiring some 40 or so endgame herbs. Flask of the Titans, for example, that's the one that gave bonus health, needed 30 Grom's Blood, these are gathered from high level zones or dungeons, 10 Stone Scale Oil, these were from fishing, and 1 Black Lotus. In fact, every flask needed a Black Lotus, so how do we get to them? Well, step 1 is going to be going out there and grinding up to 300 herbalism. Only herbalists with a max skill could even pick these in the first place. And it's classic of course, so gathering attempts can fail. You could actually have clicked a Black Lotus herb, failed the attempt, and then somebody else comes along at the right time, clicks it before you do, and takes it under your nose. One of Classic's more rage-inducing moments, that's for sure. Though, if I remember right, Tauren's plus 15 racial bonus to herbalism puts them over the failure threshold, so Tauren's OP, I guess. Black Lotus could be found in 4 high-level zones, those being Winterspring, Silithus, the Burning Steppes, and the Eastern Plaguelands. Also back in vanilla, they were their own gathering nodes. Lotus were not rare finds from other herbs, as Fel Lotus worked in TBC or Frost Lotus in Wrath. And when I say they were rare, I mean it. Unless you were properly setting in for a several-hour-long herbalism session, the chance you came across one in the wild was incredibly low. The one time I saw a Black Lotus in literally the whole of Classic was having it spawn as we were running as a guild to Molten Core, and of course somebody instantly grabbed it. The reason why they're so rare is because only one could spawn at a time in those 4 aforementioned zones, and on top of that there were a good 24 or so spawn points in each of the zones. On top of that, they had around a 1 hour respawn time each. Now, in original vanilla, sure, Black Lotus were hard to get, but the concept of full consumes for raiding was just nowhere near as commonplace as it was when we did Classic. Whether it was lack of knowledge of what consumables stack, things working differently as they have progressive patches, or just the cost of flasking up, it was less of a thing. The top-end server capacity was much lower too. The player base was simply spread out across a greater number of servers. Blizzard posts from pre-Classic launch in 2019 say as much as well. Please also note that our realm population estimates of low, medium, high, and full are based on this increased capacity. A medium realm today already has more characters on it than even the most crowded realms did back in 2006. And its estimated vanilla servers capped out around 4,000 to 5,000 players, whereas in Classic the big servers were easily over 10k. That's a whole lot more people in one place. Add on top of this the fact that nowadays people min-max the game a lot more. They want to play the top DPS with the best gear and turn up for raids with the correct enchants, food, and of course consumables, including flasks. Sure, the content was easy back then, which is why people turned to competing for speed clears or for passing, and you didn't want to be the one guy who didn't turn up with flasks when everybody else did. That just wasn't a good look for you. So what happens when we put easily 3 to 4 times the player capacity onto vanilla realms alongside a player base that is much more predisposed to min-maxing? The demand for flasks, and therefore Black Lotus, absolutely skyrockets to unreasonably high levels. Keep in mind there's 4 Lotus spawning across 4 zones per hour. That's 96 Lotus per day per realm, which isn't even enough for 3 40-man raid teams to flask up. The big servers had thousands of people trying to raid on reset days, with data from sites such as Ironforge.pro showing easily above 250,000 active raiders on most weeks during Classic. This made Black Lotus into the hottest commodity in Classic WoW by a very long way. Players who leveled early could solo farm and reap the rewards of their no-lifing, whilst the price of this virtual herb started to gain significant interest from not so legitimate methods of farming, as well as those looking to profit in the real world. And if Black Lotus were one thing, it was profitable. So to put things in perspective back then, gold was worth a lot more. These were fresh servers after all, there weren't daily quests, raw gold farms weren't as good, and only one class, the mage, could really access the best farming methods. I'd say that 1 gold back then in Classic is worth at least 10 now in Wrath. And I've got plenty of clips on the channel from back in the day between phases 1 and 2, a Black Lotus going for in excess of 200 gold, and the flasks themselves being near 230g or even more. Of course, things varied a lot here on where you played. I was on Gehennis at the time, which was a giga sweaty server, and therefore a giga expensive server. Other places had literally half the price, as you can see here. Imagine with 10 times inflation if your flasks for Nax 25 will cost you over 2,000 gold each. That's a pretty real way to think about how much these things were back then. And that's just for your flask, by the way. Nearly every consumable stack, because, you know, it's vanilla, remember? You could legit have about 24 different consumes for different occasions. Suffice to say, if you wanted to flask, you had to get out there and grind gold hard, or go farm them yourself. Neither option was without its own challenges. Early in Classic, for example, as a warlock, I went and farmed Eye of Shadow in Dark Whisper Gorge. It was a 1 in 100 drop chance and needed for priests to craft their benediction. You could get a few 200 gold for each of these drops. Later, after Dire Maul came out, I did Dire Maul East jump runs, mining the rich thorium veins at the end. They had a chance to drop an arcane crystal, which went for somewhere around 60 to 100 gold. Again, each server varied a lot here. But as a warlock, I had good options for farming. Other classes, as in everyone apart from mage to be honest, did not have things this good. Now you could always duo farm with somebody else, that was always a solid option, but then you need somebody else to be on, you have to split the gold, it can be inconvenient and so on and so forth, and people wanted to keep up, people wanted to flask, but actually going out there and farming in the open world was incredibly competitive for reasons we've already gone over, and as time went on, many people got tired with farming and looked to other sources to source their consumables. Early on in Classic, the black market for Black Lotus was booming. These are screenshots from April 2020, where one of these virtual herbs would set you back some $10, meaning a stack of Black Lotus had a pretty realistic real-world value of $200. The supply could barely match the demand, and do these prices ever show it? It's bad to me that people were willing to fork out this level of money for these items, but hey, you know what they say, time is money, friend. The relaunch of World of Warcraft had proven an extremely lucrative opportunity for gold farmers and botters, and they were fully dedicated to cornering off this market and driving prices as high as possible. If you controlled the majority of the daily 96 Lotus spawns on your realm, you could even hold stock back and create further demand for this item, and that is exactly what happened. How'd they do it? Well, there were a number of ways. First of all was establishing all these spawn locations. Thanks to the likes of add-ons, WoW heads, other server data, this was pretty fast to do. But then you have the problem of knowing where has the Lotus spawned. How can you know this without running laps of the zone and wasting a load of time? Pretty simple actually. The farmers would watch all of the Lotus spawns at the same time. Every single one. They would have level 1 characters come over to the spawns via summoning and have them die there. Then you have a ghost character watching the spawn all the time. If it spawns at that location, the herber for the zone comes along to pick it, and then you begin a timer with a pretty good idea of when to log in and next check that zone. A lot of herb mafias would come about because of this too, and on PvP servers, farmers would nearly always be able to outnumber a single player at any time of the day. I know some guilds that did this too as a bit of fun way to encourage some more PvP, and it was just a good gold farm as well. But for the average player who got on in the evening and had a couple hours to play, you were gonna seriously struggle to farm in the open world, let alone actually being able to see a single Black Lotus. It wasn't until May 2020 that Blizzard finally took action, and back then, them actually changing things was a pretty serious step. The whole no changes idea was still very strong, so for Blizzard to actively be rebalancing something in game was a big deal. This change, however, was pretty much unanimously seen as something that would overwhelmingly benefit the majority of players. They say, since the launch of WoW Classic, the game has used the spawn times and locations from original World of Warcraft, but populations and social factors have led to Black Lotus being much more scarce than it was in original WoW. We're going to increase the spawn rate of Black Lotus, and we're going to add many additional spawn locations in each of the Black Lotus zones. With a different hotfix, we're working on making it so a player cannot see a Black Lotus on screen or on their minimap if they're dead, unless they have 300 herbalism. This one fell swoop of a change hit all the points that it needed to. Gold farmers couldn't camp level 1 corpses on spawn points anymore, and the availability of Black Lotus went up around 4 times or so. Player estimates following the update reckon that Lotus spawn timers went as low as 15 minutes, down from 1 hour, and there was now multiple different spawn timers per zone and a load more spawn locations. Though gold farmers still went after Lotus, there were just so many more now, casual players had a realistic chance to get them, and the prices on the auction house started to come down. I have some footage showing the massive rise in quantity on the auction house alongside a huge price drop just after this change was made across both EU and NA. There was definitely a knee-jerk reaction to this change, mainly because people were drip selling Lotus on the auction house and wanted to offload in case they crashed, but prices settled to more reasonable amounts, though flasks were still around the 80 to 100 gold mark. It was a lot more attainable than they were going to be if they kept going up. In the Burning Crusade and Wrath, of course, the Lotus of the expansion are just rare drops from high-level herbs, and even in Season of Mastery, Blizzard made this change so Black Lotus would drop from high-level herbs too. Maybe that was just the sensible solution the whole time. But that's the story of the Black Lotus in Classic, and I don't think there's been something quite like it since. Maybe Darkmoon card greatness, that's kind of expensive to get early on in Wrath, but it's a one-time thing. You certainly aren't out there grinding gold weekly just to be able to raid anymore, that's for sure. It's one of the many things that made Classic an experience which is apart from other versions of World of Warcraft, and a special one at that. Vanilla World of Warcraft is a version of the game that people have been coming back to now for closing in on 2 decades. At this point, it's proven itself as a truly timeless game for so many of us around the entire world. It was the version of WoW that started off this crazy journey so many years ago, and on its re-release in 2019, it once again dominated the whole gaming market for a second time. And whether you compare Vanilla to its other options within the MMO genre, or just to other WoW expansions, it just does certain things differently. Vanilla was and still is really a unique experience, but what exactly sets it apart? What are the main things that this version of World of Warcraft isn't shy to do, which typically games these days are? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. 10 of the ways which Vanilla plays that make it, well, the vanilla World of Warcraft experience that we know and love. I did try to put these in order as well, but each one, although not as gameplay impacting as the next, does seem important to the overall pacing and just the feel of the game. So with that said, these for me are the top 10 things that make vanilla vanilla. When you first arrive upon the grand world of Azeroth, you're going to be doing a lot of running about to hand in quests, to get to new zones, pick up flight paths, and so on. Some classes are lucky enough to get hold of a movement speed ability early on, such as Aspect of the Cheetah, Ghost Wolf, or Travel Form, but for every class in the game, you need to wait all the way until level 40 before you can buy a proper mount and start riding around at an impressive bonus 60% speed. And your first mount is a big investment. I mean, unless you're a Warlock or a Paladin, you get them for free, but for everyone else it's a big investment. I don't know about you, but oftentimes after I've just bought a mount on a character, I still catch myself running about because I just get so used to it. And while some of those journeys you have to do on foot are super long, such as the first trip from the wetlands up to Arathi Highlands on Alliance, or, you know, just going anywhere in the Barrens it feels like, it gives the world that scope of size which it's famous for. And your first mount will also set you back 90 gold or so after your faction discounts, and if you haven't been particularly careful with your gold up to level 40, you probably won't even be able to afford it for some time. I'd say on a regular playthrough on a first character on a fresh server, most people are getting their mounts somewhere between level 44 to 46. That wouldn't be unreasonable. To really be able to get it at 40, you have to have it in mind from the beginning and work towards it, use the auction house, send things to your bank alt, and so on. And that's even before we get to level 60, where your epic mount is going to set you back a crazy 1000 gold. But the thing is, the game isn't afraid to have you run around on foot for ages. I mean, experience-wise, level 37 is about a third of the way to 60, and 44 is about halfway. So just on experience alone, you can tell how much of the game you're going to be running for. But I think that time you spend on foot running around the world is super important for vanilla, for the world building, for the importance on planning where you're going to go, for PvP, and so much more. And so that is why I think it was worth a mention here. Next up is something that we will all run across during our time playing WoW, and those are of course item upgrades. In vanilla, you start with essentially nothing and have to work your way up from grade quality trash items all the way to epics. And the quest rewards and upgrades in vanilla can feel like a big deal simply because there's such a massive disparity between the power level of different items that you are rewarded. I mean, for example, this quest gives you a cloth chest with strength on as a reward. By the way, this is from quite a long quest chain that has you going all around the world. Or maybe you get a plate item with a bunch of spirit on. You kind of ask yourselves, what exactly were the devs thinking here? And whenever I say this, I always hear somebody saying that the devs wanted you to be able to distinguish between the good and bad items. And man, did they go all out on bad items, so you really get to see them a lot. I mean, to be fair, spirit is actually a half decent stat when you're leveling early game, but it does fall off unless you're a class which really benefits from it, such as a shadow priest. Then again, in a sea of items with highly questionable tunable stats for flavor, there are also some massive upgrades which you will equip as soon as possible, and you'll probably keep them on for about 20 levels or so. Think of the Seal of Rin from the long quest chain on Alliance, the Whirlwind Axe from the Warrior exclusive quest, or the Rune of the Guard Captain from that Horde quest in the Hinterlands. Going out of your way for those big quest rewards is most definitely worth it in vanilla, and you really feel the power of your upgrades when your abilities start hitting that much bit more. And having gone on that journey to get them, instead of just going to the auction house and pressing buy, makes them feel even more satisfying to get. And this trend of items being massive upgrades definitely continues at endgame too, with certain items being constantly in high demand, such as Ring of Ecuria, Onslaught Girdle, Chromatically Tempered Sword, Drakefang Talisman, and so many more. Huge item upgrades are a big part of vanilla, and you really feel when you get one. Next up is regarding classes, and specifically those little things that each class has which, although they tend to rarely be useful, are small bonuses which make them what they are. I'm talking about things such as water breathing or walking on the Shaman, detect invisibility on Warlock, divine intervention on Paladin, or eagle eye on Hunter. Quite a few of these flavor type abilities were just ideas that were had during earlier stages of World of Warcraft's development, but were left in the game because they added that little extra bit to the feel of each class within the game. And understanding these niche abilities and knowing how they can fit in your class's total toolkit can absolutely make a difference. When I'm playing a Shaman, I always ensure I have a stack of each reagent so I can water walking or breathing. There's plenty of underwater quests. Detect invisibility on the Warlock can be used to see enemy patrols before they end up chain pulling and causing a disaster in dungeons such as Diamore West. Divine intervention is a good last resort when a wipe is occurring so you can save a healer and begin resurrecting. And Eagle Eye on a Hunter is super useful for finding patrolling mobs or rare spawns within a zone. I mean, speaking of unique class abilities, you can even change your character's language to speak in their native tongue instead of the common languages everyone can understand. Someone out there needs to be mad enough to do a Night Elf playthrough where they only speak Darnassian, and every time they want to talk, somebody has to translate for them. Over time in WoW, Blizzard would gradually prune many of these abilities out of your spellbook as they were deemed unnecessary clutter, and then in more recent expansions they've started to add them back in again because they realized actually they're pretty cool. But at the start in vanilla, these small extra additions did feel as though they made a difference. Next I want to talk about the open world nature of vanilla World of Warcraft. Whilst it's not by any means a full sandbox MMO insofar as you can really choose your path at all times and build anything anywhere, it certainly has a lot more choice than the expansions which follow it. You can definitely travel to areas which are high level or go into enemy territory. It's just the case the game will throw a skull level enemy at you that's going to 2-tap you, at which point you'll probably realise that you're not supposed to be there. There is also much less of a feeling of hand holding and the game putting you on a set path. This is a big difference from many games nowadays where you almost get the impression that the developers have decided you need to know where to go and what to do at all times, otherwise you're going to get bored and quit. Vanilla isn't afraid to leave matters up to the player in terms of where you'll go, what you'll do, how you'll build your character, the gear that you'll use, and so on. I mean, imagine a totally new player to vanilla who's never played it before without add-ons or guides trying to find their way through the world. When the game first launched, that's what it was like for everyone. I mean, for me at least it was, I can say that. It's not that resources didn't exist online to find things, but my internet was so bad that each internet page would take minutes to load, and I would have rather just been playing the game during that time. The freedom to just go and do stuff has also lended it quite well to vanilla's replayability, as we've seen through Blizzard's attempts on seasonal servers in Season of Mastery and Discovery, as well as players taking on the hardcore challenge. Overall, vanilla is a game that's not afraid for you to go out in the world and learn about it, and for me that's definitely been a strength. Speaking of freedom within the game and learning about it, that really brings me to my next point. Vanilla is on a surface level very simple to play, but there's a crazy amount of depth to it. I mean, for real, you can get so far in vanilla on some basic gameplay. You can be keyboard turning, clicking, the lot. And then you get to endgame raids where many classes' rotations are about 3 buttons, and if you're a caster, you literally just stand at the back and press 1 button on repeat, and that is it. You are actually playing the game in an optimal way because it's just that simple. But there is a near endless amount of extra things to know about vanilla, which of course the game never tells you. Melee leeway, the 5-second rule, how to make different macros, or, you know, the entire threat mechanic, which is absolutely core to every single aspect of PvE within the game. You have no way of knowing how it works without add-ons. You don't know good leveling routes within the game, which spec to go, which items are the best, and so on. The more you dig into it, the more there is to know about vanilla World of Warcraft. And the main point here is I feel as though it's a game which primarily rewards game knowledge over game skill. Player ability and skill can matter, of course, in certain scenarios, such as PvP, but just knowing a lot about the game will serve you super well. And just when you feel like you know everything about vanilla WoW, you always end up finding something else out. So that's why for me, vanilla is simple to play but has so much depth to it, and it really becomes more noticeable the more you play. Next up is the fact that in vanilla we have a more dangerous open world, as well as certain elite zones which can be very difficult to solo. Fresh out your starter zone at level 6, you're probably feeling pretty confident. The mobs in starter zones move slower, they can be neutral, and they're generally pretty easy to deal with. And then you step foot in that open world and it becomes immediately apparent that you are in fact not very strong at all. Whether it's kobolds respawning in the mines in Elwyn, Defias over in Westfall, or the classic Son of Aragorn death down in Silverpine, the world of Warcraft can come at you pretty fast. Most classes consider anything more than 2 mobs at once to be a serious threat in vanilla, and you'd need to use some serious cooldowns, if you even have any that is. And at times an enemy mob can just decide they're going to dodge or parry about 6 times in a row and you just lose a 1v1. And then there's mages of course who can pull a dozen things at once and AoE them down, but you know, just hero class things. But the open world is dangerous, it feels that way, and it never stops being dangerous either, right from that moment when you leave your starter zone all the way to level 60. It's things like this that make the hardcore challenge so interesting to people. There really is a constant threat of making a fatal mistake. At the same time in vanilla, there are open world elite zones to take on too, which are often great for XP and can have some nice quest rewards too. Though you're not really supposed to take them on solo, but it can be a nice test of skill to see if you can do it. Otherwise, you do as the game intends and you naturally run into other people in the same place doing the same quest and you group up so it becomes easier. This is one of the ways that vanilla encourages you to form parties and meet other people within the world, but only if you want to do so, and I think that is quite important to remember. Next is a moment that we have all experienced, I am sure, and on each character when it happens, it feels just as good as the last time. It's like a World of Warcraft graduation moment, and that's of course when you finally equip your first shoulder and helm slot items. In fact, for that matter, you don't really get neck items or rings or trinkets, and definitely not idols, librams or totems for ages either, as in the ones you equip. The difference is though, you can see your shoulder and helm items on your character, so that just makes them better, doesn't it? I mean, even around level 18 or so, you might randomly come across a common quality pair of shoulders, but it still feels good to equip them, even though stats wise they're basically doing nothing for you. As for your helm, well, that comes quite a bit later, and for a regular character you'll be seeing that somewhere between levels 25 to 30. It's the scarcity of these items at early levels which makes dungeons such as Scarlet Monastery Armory such a big deal. It doesn't have to just be your helm or shoulder items either, just getting your first bag in vanilla feels good. There's nothing like starting your first quest within the game on a fresh character and you instantly just get a 6-slot bag in your inventory. It's the true sign of a blessed character. And even in later levels when you loot a traveler's knapsack, that just feels great as well. Even if you want to sell it, you're going to get a few gold. In a game where your inventory can fill up so fast, that matters. Which leaves us with what I feel are 3 of the most important things which make vanilla what it is. So first up, I've got something which I think can be a little bit overlooked in vanilla, but for me it's always felt really important, and that's having the feeling of going back to a major town or city after a long questing trip and restocking and sorting out your bags before you're ready to head out once again. Imagine the scenario, you've been out in Stranglethorn Vale questing for a few hours and your bags are now full of random meat, troll sweat, wild vine, and about 24 different other random items. You're starting to run low on food and water and you've gone through your health pots as well. But at the same time, for all this work, you've got a quest log which is absolutely full and completed to show. That moment when you finally head back to Booty Bay, sell all your trash, mail the good stuff to your bank vault, turn in all those quests, sort out your gear and so on, just feels so good to do. Maybe you head over to Stormwind afterwards, check the auction house for upgrades, get more food and water and health pots, go to your class trainer to get new skills. Maybe whilst you're there a world buff drops and hey, you're ready to go, bags clean, gear repaired, to head back out there and get stuck into the world once again with a fresh set of quests to work on. Those moments when you pause to just sort things out, for me, add so much to the game, and it's something that everybody does. It also encourages that planning aspect of vanilla in terms of what quests will I do now, where do I want to go next, and so on. So for me, this whole ritual everyone does just adds a bunch to the game. And number 2 is something which I feel as though ties a number of points that I've gone over together, and that's the fact that in vanilla, leveling feels important. And it feels as though it has as much or even more at times importance than the end game. In future expansions, Blizzard started accelerating leveling a lot to get you caught up with the current expansion and into the new content as well as the end game. This started as early as midway through TBC, when Blizzard went back and reduced the amount of experience needed between 20 and 60, as well as making some of those iconic open world elite zones non-elite anymore. In Wrath, they further squished XP, added heirlooms and the LFD, and well, things just really went from there. Of course, by WoW's current expansion, you can't expect a new player to be spending 100 hours in vanilla and the same amount on each subsequent expansion, so I get why things were sped up over time, but in vanilla the world was the main character. Blizzard themselves have even said as much. And your character's progression, power gain and growth over that journey is part of what's given vanilla such longevity over the years, to the point where people are still hyped about going again on a fresh character to this day. Which means that number 1, the most important thing which makes vanilla vanilla for me is, well, something no expansion can ever do, because it's the fact that vanilla is not an expansion. When you start here, you start at level 1 with nothing in your bags, barely any gear, and it's a new adventure every single time. I mean, sure, if you played the game a lot before, you can mail yourself gear, you can boost and so on, but that's up to you whether or not you want to do that. Every single player starts off in the same way in vanilla as the humble adventurer. You're a small person in a very big world, delivering letters, solving small problems, and eventually you're led to doing great things towards the endgame of WoW. I mean, if you just stop and think for a moment, when's the first time you actually fight a full-grown dragon in World of Warcraft? Sure, you've got the whelplings over in the wetlands, there's drakes in Badlands, but a fully grown dragon, that's properly endgame material, such as the Green Dragon world bosses or Veilstraz the Corrupt in BWL. When expansion started, the old world felt as though it changed from the main character of the game to just an obstacle which you needed to overcome so that you could progress onto expansions and the new content as soon as possible. And when you were starting on an expansion, your character was already quite powerful with all your gear and abilities, and you just went from there. But that is not the case for vanilla, and I think ultimately having that progression path from 1 to 60 in a cohesive world is something that truly makes vanilla the game that it is. Classic WoW has a side to it that we've never seen, from scrap zones to removed dungeons, unfinished quest lines, and so much more. When Blizzard set out to make Classic originally, there was such a large volume of content built up that they wanted to put in the game, they physically did not have time to get it all done. The level cap was supposed to be 70, Northrend was seen on early versions of the map, and the Black Temple was even originally a dungeon, amongst many other things. Eventually though, it was packaged together into whole expansions rather than just continuing on patch by patch, and that's become the way Blizzard have done major gameplay updates ever since. Vanilla was really unique in this regard because at its outset it was the only version of WoW which really would have made sense if it just did continue through patches instead of your standard expansion with its whole new zones, raids, quests and so on. Currently in the classic WoW space, a lot of people are looking for a bit of vanilla action, be it a fresh, a seasonal, or something with a twist on the original experience. So I thought, why not highlight just how much of vanilla was not finished, and ask what if we never did get expansions, what content was cut or moved back, and what is the side of vanilla which we never really got to see. I want to start off on some loose ends that vanilla has, things which were started and not finished until in some cases years later. One of the more interesting ones, and a questline which is really easy to miss following through fully, starts right at the end of Alderman. You know the deal, you beat Arcades, who is about 5 levels higher than anything else in the dungeon because classic dungeon design, the rogue in the party loots the chests before anyone has a chance to say anything, and then you go click the large discs at the back of the room and start the quest, The platinum discs. This has you take your discovery back to either Ironforge or Thunderbluff, which will give a follow-up reward with some potions and a nice 14 slot bag too. But that is not where this questline ends. The bit people often miss is this unlocks a new quest which you are not directed to in any way because classic quest design, called Portents of Uldum. Your faction historians have found that there may be a link between these discs you found in Uldaman and a mysterious gate on the southern end of Tanaris, and they want you to take those discs there and just see what happens. Upon arrival, a pedestal sits outside of the gate. When activated, it states the player must also have the Plates of Uldum before access can be granted, and since, well, you don't have them, it's back to your faction's capitals to report on this, with the quest ominously ending saying, "Be sure to check back with us soon. Uldum beckons." In reality, it was not beckoning very hard, as this is where the quest ended, and Uldum as a zone would not officially release in World of Warcraft until Cataclysm dropped some 6 years later. You can still see loads of comments from players who were wondering where this story would go after having finished it. Also, I was curious, so I went and had a look for the discs of Uldum in-game as a physical item, and I could not find them referenced anywhere. There's only replica discs that were added as a trash item when Uldum as a zone was revisited during 8.3 in BFA. I guess for Kata, Deathwing just kind of blew the gate off or something. That sounds lore friendly enough to me. Maybe there could be a way to obtain these discs of Uldum in vanilla, like some kind of attunement, and then open Uldum as a new late game vanilla zone. Speaking of quest chains that ended rather abruptly, there is another big one that so many people will have done and very few ever ended up following through. So after battling through hordes of undead trolls, solving puzzles, and reminding your group to kill every dragon mob in sight, you eventually make it to the final boss of the Sunken Temple, the Shade of Aranicus. It can be a bit of a tricky fight due to his level and spamming CC, but once he's down you get the Chained Essence of Aranicus, a trinket that poisons enemies in a small area around you, which is okay. It can be useful in AoE pulls and for debuffing rogues in PvP so they can't constantly re-stealth. What you also get here is a start of a quest to go and speak to Itharius, who is using the amazingly scuffed old high elf model. To proceed further, however, you have to hand in your Chained Essence trinket to the quest giver, which can seem like a pretty big price when half-decent trinkets are just kinda, well, non-existent in Classic for the most part. This then has a follow-up where you have to journey across the land and sea to the faraway Winterspring to talk to Umbrance the Spirit Speaker, where the quest just randomly ends. There isn't even a mysterious cliffhanger, it's just straight up not finished. In fact, the quest makes it sound like you're going to need to collect some object for the Spirit Speaker to allow him to contact and help Aranicus. I even found a comment on Wowhead quoting a blue post on this premature quest ending, saying more will be added to the Aranicus quest chain in a future patch. I can't reveal anything further at this time, but from what I've seen, it's going to be really cool and fairly rewarding. Or neither of the above. I have a feeling this could have been linked into the Emerald Dream storyline, which we can talk about later, that was also not finished during vanilla. Similar to Uldum, this could serve as a point to pick up an interesting storyline for players to explore, or at least finish a quest line and add in some kind of other reward, since you had to give in your trinket for a bit of XP and gold. One more quest related one now, or I guess more of a reputation grind. So far north in Winterspring are the creatively named Winterspring Trainers, which consist of one night elf chilling, quite literally, on top of a rock. Farming rep through repeatable quests with this one-man faction will eventually unlock the Winterspring Frostsaber, a unique recolor of this mount so you can stand out a little bit in the crowd. However, it being a night elf, it's gonna be alliance only. But what if I told you the Horde were supposed to have their own counterpart to this quest in vanilla too? Because I'm pretty sure that they did, but it just never got finished. In Ungoro Crater, there are 2 NPCs, one to the southeast and one to the northwest, who are part of the Ravasor Trainers. Both of these were removed at the start of TBC, but in Wrath you can head over to Morvek in the southeast and start to learn how to tame and eventually own your own Venomhide Ravasor. These quests are really just for the completionist who want an excuse to play the game more and chase a hard mount, but it would be a pretty easy thing to add into vanilla to mirror a piece of content which ended up being alliance only. A much bigger part of the game next, and one that underwent many changes from alpha to release in vanilla, those being the NPC and character models that we used in the game. I read online now and again that some people are interested in using updated models in vanilla, but what if we went the other way instead and brought back more usage of the older alpha models? Now, to be fair, they are used now and again. In the Dead Mines, the Defias miners are using the old human worker variants, and Defias ambushers can spawn as part of an event just outside of Stormwind. These guys have a more thin, roguey type appearance. Certain South Sea pirates also use old models too. There's actually plenty of examples that made it into the live game. But do you remember the old character models that there used to be? Some really didn't undergo too many changes, such as Night Elf or Tauren. Others, however, like Early Undead or the infamous female troll, are a little bit different from the end result. When you see some of these old models, you do start to realize why Blizzard in some cases decided that they would be better off canning them rather than trying to shoehorn them into the game somewhere. But perhaps it could be a bit more variety to character customization, add something to the appearances we are used to, or just to throw some of the questionable models back into the game as NPCs or enemies. But the area where the most content didn't make it into the game compared to how much was planned has to be zones. Which is crazy if you think about it, because vanilla is by a huge margin the largest version of WoW ever. Among the capitals of Azeroth, the one that perhaps underwent the most changes was Ironforge. Alpha Ironforge was very different to the end result that we got on launch, with far more narrow pathways throughout the city, bridges all over the place on upper levels to support houses and stores, and the central Great Forge was, well, a lot more forgy as opposed to the huge pool of lava that we have now. Comparatively, Ironforge these days is a lot more open and has more of a grand and majestic feeling to it, as opposed to a more dark and gritty dwarven city. Explorers over the years in World of Warcraft have also shown off old Ironforge, or the Hall of Thanes, an unused location underneath Ironforge that was present in game files and can still be explored to this day if you know how to clip through the wall. This location was later used in the 4.1 PTR during Cataclysm as a return to this particular area to give players an official chance to see what had been lurking below for all this time. Next up, Ashara. It always felt like a zone which was lacking on content. Aside from a couple quests specific to the Hoarder Alliance, a location for plenty of the Sunken Temple class quests, and the incredibly inconveniently located Duke Hydraxis, there ain't all that much there, and there's quite likely some good reasons for that, because content was planned for Ashara, but it just didn't end up happening. There are two major things that we know about, both of which ended up getting scrapped. The Ashara Crater Battleground. This was going to be another PvP addition to the game with a more Dota or MOBA gameplay theme to it. Though how that would have worked in an MMO, I'm not entirely sure, but if Blizzard did do it then, there would have been a very early adopter to the third-person MOBA. This Battleground idea was in consideration as early as patch 1.3, and will be a repeat topic for Blizzard during Wrath, and was even brought up for Mists of Pandaria. Unfortunately, it fell to the wayside and never came to the light, and has been sitting out as a missing piece of content ever since. These days, I think having a MOBA type battleground in an MMO when the MOBA genre has existed for so many years now and is well established might be a bit of a tough sell. Another major piece of content was the Bay of Storms instance, with many screenshots online of a placeholder portal being in the vanilla beta for this. Back then, every single instance portal looked like the Dark Portal, by the way. Very little is known about what this sub-zone could have held. Was it going to be a dungeon? Was it going to be a raid? Was it going to be underwater? Would it have made Ashara more of an active zone? Probably. If I can say one thing about Ashara though, it's maybe that Blizzard did not want it to be seen. It's a very beautiful zone when you're flying above it, but for a game with no flying mounts, the way the zone is set out can be very frustrating when you're either doing some Olympic-length swim to get between quests, or trying not to fall off a cliff to your doom. Grim Batol is another subzone with an interesting story that could be realised in the game. As a short rundown of one of the stories that's happened there, it was once home to the Dragonmaw clan, where Alexstrasza was held captive. Grim Batol served as a base of operations, where the Orcs aimed to raise a secret army to lay waste to the Alliance. However, an unlikely force led by Ronin managed to free her, where she went on to destroy the remainder of the Dragonmaw clan. Now, we don't need to copy-paste the storyline. Maybe having Alexstrasza being held captive in Classic sounds like a little bit much, but a mid-level dungeon involving the Dragonmaw in the wetlands, that could work. There aren't exactly a ton of dungeons around that area, and it would be very much in line with an existing enemy already found in that zone. Of course, during the Cataclysm, Grim Batol would be brought back and finally revealed as a dungeon, where thematically you ride a dragon in at the start and destroy most of the trash as you begin. Moving on though, the Hellfire Peninsula was also in development during vanilla, though would only go on to be be released during TBC. It was expected to be a later game zone, and from looking at it, it's quite reminiscent of its end result. Early versions had way more items flying in the air though, similar to how Nagrand ended up being. I think putting Hellfire in vanilla would be difficult though. It's kind of inexorably linked to the idea of going through the dark portal, and once you cross that threshold, well, surely it has to be a lot more than just one new zone, especially when that zone isn't hugely different from what ends up being playable in the expansion. Another piece of TBC content present in vanilla was the Caverns of Time, located in eastern Tanaris. Through some creative wall jumping, you can get in there, and, well, it's basically exactly what's shipped alongside TBC. Caverns of Time has always been a very intriguing place. Whenever there's a need to put something in the game which doesn't really fit with a timeline, just throw it in the Caverns of Time, say it's magic, bronze dragonflight, job done. From the culling of Strathholm, the battle for Mount Hyjal, to the Dragon Soul, and many more. This place has allowed for the WoW devs to tell many stories from the past all over again. Again, not really sure how much it fits into vanilla and to what extent it could be used, but if it was, well, Warcraft 3 certainly has enough story packed into it to make many instances off of. One of World of Warcraft's most famous raids ever surely would deserve a chance for a reboot in some format or another. I mean, beyond vanilla, it's both a raid in TBC and a two-part dungeon in Legion. I'm of course talking about Karazhan. From World of Warcraft's alpha and beta, work was already put into this location, with room after room being sculpted out, though it was definitely in need of a lot more work. There are also the crypts below, which have been explorable for a very long time, but again, they were never used in the actual game until, I believe, Legion for certain artifact weapons such as the Moonkin's Scythe of Elune. Karazhan is a mysterious and magical location though. More or less anything could go here in regards to it being a dungeon or a piece of raiding content. Maybe you even have it be a zone where the inside of the tower is considerably larger than it appears from the outside. You can always just say it's magic, right? As mentioned earlier, the Emerald Dream has had frequent mentions throughout the Warcraft universe, in Night Elf questing, Moonglade, Druid questing, as well as the huge physical portals that the Green Dragon world bosses guard scattered across the world. The closest we've gotten to an Emerald Dream in World of Warcraft was the somewhat disappointing opening raid of Legion, the Emerald Nightmare. The only legacy that left behind was it being one of, if not the easiest mythic raids of all time. It was cleared in a bit over 12 hours on its opening day. Didn't make for much of a world first race, that one. I will say, after having defeated Xavius, the area afterwards was a nice look into how the dream would have been. For Classic, there was technically an Emerald Dream in the game files, which, as you can imagine, was huge, open, expansive fields, alien plants, and colossal trees on a seemingly endless scale, though it just never quite found its way into being a completed idea, even though it was indicated at an early stage that a lot of work had gone into it, with Jeff Kaplan being quoted as saying, "The Emerald Dream is shaping up to be extremely cool. We don't want to preview any of the content yet, as it is endgame, and we want some surprises for players. The zone is massive and beautiful, and once the content team is done with it, it will be exceedingly challenging." It almost sounds as though there was a lot more done than just a level design here. Maybe what they cooked up back then was used in a future expansion in a not so obvious way. That tends to be the case. Speaking of content used in a future expansion, the World of Warcraft team at one point were very much considering player housing. Housing had been a feature of many of the successful predecessors to World of Warcraft, such as Star Wars Galaxy or Ultima Online, and well, Blizzard weren't exactly out to redesign the wheel with World of Warcraft now, were they? From the very outset of World of Warcraft, giving players the ability to create their own home was something under consideration. It just never took that top priority spot to really be worked on over other features for such a long time. Yet remnants of it remain in the game, such as the portal behind a portcullis in Stormwind. This was to be the entrance to the residential district. Eventually, I think we can say one of two things happened to housing in World of Warcraft. Either you see Warlords of Draenor's garrison system as it was certainly very ambitious, but often left players feeling as though they had a little reason to leave their own instance version of the world, as everything they needed was right there. More social or communal residents could have been interpreted from the class order halls of Legion. Mages got a tower of practice and learning, warriors got a glorious skybound arena, and rogues got a murky sewer. I'm surprised they haven't tried to bring order halls back already, to be honest. It could be a core expansion feature as far as I'm concerned. But we have never had housing as it's been seen in other games, as in a customizable building which enables you to choose things such as item placement, decoration, theme, and so on. I really don't know how housing would fit into Classic, whether it makes sense. There is kind of a nice thing about Stormwind, Ironforge, Orgrimmar, and so on being busy, and if you want something to be personal to the player, does it have to be separate? Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. It really is amazing just how much content was planned for vanilla, and to look back and see what was scrapped, what was unfinished, and what just needed a few more expansions to come to life. I think it goes without saying I've definitely been speculating from a Classic Plus angle on this video too, and I hope this shows how much extra stuff there possibly could be in Classic, whilst keeping things very true to how the game was back then.